Good morning to everybody. Can you hear me in Pecos Hall?
Yes, we hear you.
Excellent, thank you. My name is Gerasimos Rosados. I am the acting director of the Oil Conservation Division. I'm also the acting chair for the Oil Conservation Commission. Today is April the 21st, 2025. We have our meeting and hearing today. So what I would like to do is start our meeting this morning, and I'd like to do a roll call. As I stated, I am Gerasimos Rosados. I am the acting director and the acting commission chair for the Oil Conservation Commission, and then I'll turn it over to Commissioner Bloom. We'll start with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Greg Bloom, designee of the Commissioner of Public Lands, and I am just here for the Apache and Northwind cases, and I'll step out, and Balin Lampkin will take my place for the Goodnight Empire case. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Mpoma.
Good morning. I'm Dr. William Mpoma, Professor of Petroleum Engineering at New Mexico Tech, and then also designee of the Energy Secretary. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And just to let everybody know, Mr. Zachary Chandler is also going to be appearing via Teams this week as well. So he will be on the platform also if we need anything. Excellent. So our roll call is done. So let's move to the approval of the April 21st to the 25th, 2025 agenda. May I get a motion for that approval?
Mr. Chair, I so move.
I second.
Excellent, thank you. So the agenda for this meeting has been approved. Our third item is the approval of the March 11th, 2025 meeting minutes. Commissioner Bloom, I just wanted to make sure you had wanted some time to be able to review it. Were you able to review the minutes?
Mr. Chair, yes, I did. I suggested a couple corrections, and I think those were sent around by Sheila, so we should be good for a motion on that.
Excellent. Okay, so you're moving for the motion. If we could get it a second, please.
I second.
Excellent. So those minutes have been approved as well. I don't know if Mr. Chandler is on right at the moment, but did we have any pending litigation? As I stated, I don't think he's on right at the moment, so I don't think we have any other pending litigation. And did we have any other business that we needed to address, commissioners?
No, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Mpoma?
No from my side.
Excellent. So our next meeting is scheduled for May the 15th, 2025. So let's mark that on our calendars as well. We did have some cases that we wanted to do before we actually went into the actual hearing. So our first pending case is case number 24881, application of Northwood Midstream Partners, LLC, for approval of an additional redundant acid gas injection well and to amend order number R20913 as amended and SWD 2622 to authorize an increased shared maximum daily injection rate in Lee County, New Mexico. Are all individuals for this particular case present?
Mr. Chair, Commissioners, Adam Rankin with the Senate Office of Holland and Hart, appearing on behalf of Northwood Midstream Partners, LLC.
Excellent, Mr. Rankin.
This is Jesse Tremaine for the Oil Conservation Division.
Excellent, Mr. Rankin. Thank you. So this is a presentation of a final order, correct?
Correct, Mr. Chair. We circulated a proposed draft final order middle of last week for the Commission to review and consider, proposing the adoption or granting of the application as requested with the modifications that came up from the hearing and adopting the division's proposed conditions as modified during the hearing.
Okay, Mr. Tremaine, just making sure that you agree and you have no issues.
We reviewed the proposal and agree with the content. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Commissioners, did you have any questions on the final order?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay,
No, Mr. Chair.
Mpoma? Excellent. Okay, so we will process that final order and we will continue on with that. Any questions, Mr. Rankin or Mr. Tremaine?
No, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners.
None for OCD. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so that one's completed. We'll move on to case number 24912. It's the application of Apache Corporation for an adjudicatory hearing to contest the division's conditions of appeal on Apache Corporation's scope of work for additional investigation in Lee County, New Mexico. It's a matter to be heard. Motion to amend order R23728. Are all parties present?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, Dal Mullenberg from Gallagher and Kennedy for Apache Corporation. Along with me is Samantha Catalano.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Mullenberg.
And this is Jesse Tremaine for the Oil Conservation Division. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Mullenberg, we'll turn it over to you for your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the commission. You'll all recall that we had a hearing in this matter on January. We then had an order that was issued by the commission in February. Apache moved for rehearing of that matter. The commission didn't act on that. So with that, the order became final, other than subject to a court appeal. Since the hearing, Apache has conducted another round of groundwater monitoring, reported the results to the division, and also conducted, along with others, some of the investigations prompted by the groundwater monitoring conducted before the hearing. We then, after reporting those results, consulted with the division and discussed whether we could reach agreement on a slightly modified groundwater monitoring plan after having looked at all of the additional information. We were able to come to an agreement on that. The agreement makes some slight adjustments to some of the monitoring wells. There are, I think, about 4 fewer monitoring wells, but essentially the monitoring wells that were dropped are more or less replaced by a good spacing around the perimeter of the area. I would say the interior monitoring wells have largely been untouched. The joint motion on behalf of Apache and the division summarizes those changes for you, provides a map, and with that, we would ask the commission's approval of the joint motion. And along with the joint motion, there is an Exhibit A that would be essentially the new directive for groundwater monitoring at the site.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mullenberg. Mr. Tremaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Commissioners. As you recall, we had a contested hearing in this matter. I think a couple of things to point out are that at the time of the hearing, we had fourth quarter monitoring that was concerning to the division, and the consultant or a new consultant for Apache was newer to the case. Since that order was issued, we've had multiple meetings with Apache and the consultant. OCD has reviewed the technical aspects of the revised proposal and met all of the asks that OCD has made in terms of content of the reports and the sampling. This does revise the position of certain of the wells, but this proposal is well within a range that OCD was seeking when we went to hearing. So we are satisfied with this as as a worthwhile proposal in terms of the next step of remediation and characterization. So I agree with Mr. Mullenberg that certain of the wells that are removed are replaced based on the positioning of other wells. There are some other changes, such as there are areas of concern identified by both OCD and Apache related to landscape scarring, potential sources of chlorides from historic or potentially newer releases. And so some of the wells have been changed to a monitoring well, downgrading of that location, but a soil boring. in the scarring location. And we think that that is actually a net positive from the result of the hearing. That was something that was not discussed before. And lastly, one of the primary objectives of the division in this case was to get us to a resolution on the next stage of characterization and identification of contamination. We believe that this does that. Because with this proposal, Apache will waive their right to appeal, and there are still legal arguments between the parties. So we believe that this is something that the commission should strongly consider, and we ask you to approve. It gets us to where the division believes that we need to be for the next stage of remediation, and in a modified way achieves, we believe, what the order issued by the commission would have achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tremaine. The commissioners, any questions?
Mr. Chair, do we have a map for the new proposed locations?
I am not sure. I know the exhibits were submitted. I am kind of looking through it myself. My apologies. Exhibit A does not have a map on it. There was also an Exhibit B.
Exhibit B does have the map. Yeah.
Yeah, it's on Exhibit B. Mr. Mullenberg, I will ask a question. So on this Exhibit B, the new where it's the wells that are designated as new 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are the new wells, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that is correct. There, as Mr. Tremaine indicated, some slight adjustments of the location of a few other wells in the interior, but those 6 wells are the new well locations.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Mpoma, did you have any questions on that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. So if you look at the map, it sounds like the new wells are more on the exterior side. So can the parties explain how they more or less reach an agreement to site these new wells right at the exterior? Even though during the hearing, OCD did have a concern that even the interior portion has not been fully delineated.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, I can explain that briefly, and if you have more technical questions, we do have Mr. Grams, our consultant, online who could respond to that. But mostly, Mr. Grams took a look at where we were with the spacing of the perimeter wells and made some slight adjustments, in some cases moving wells slightly outward at locations where it would be expected to be fully outside of the plume and provide a clear delineation in that area that it's not affected. In other cases, for example, in the southern portion, there's new 5 and new 6, which were intended to just provide better spacing. I think there was a well down there, it's not shown on the map, proposed by Apache that was TMW 25, that was more or less in between and perhaps a little to the south of those. So it was really just to improve the spacing of the perimeter delineation to make sure that the monitoring captures all of the potential areas where the plume might be, or in the northern area, obviously, to space the upgradient wells more appropriately.
So is it my understanding that, let's say, assuming new 5 and then new 6, new 4, and a new 3, and then also the northern one. So once you drill these wells, and then you sample and you do not see any chloride in the analysis then more or less shows that you've been able to delineate the boundaries of the plume. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not have any further questions.
If I may,
Mr. Tremaine, you wanted to add on, correct?
I did just want to point out for the record that those are revised wells, but the green wells on the map do reflect that we've retained. So one of the questions was, how are we delineating and the interior and addressing OCD's concerns with the interior? And so those are not represented in the yellow wells. Those are the green wells on the map. And so the bulk of those wells from the order have been retained. So the interior is resolved by those. And then, for instance, if you look up at the upper right-hand corner of the map, that's reflected as existing well TMW 13, the green TMW 33 from the order, and the SB 1, soil boring 1. So in OCD's proposals and our discussions, we previously proposed a groundwater monitoring well at SB 1 because we wanted to know what was up with that scarring at that location, right? The lack of vegetation, but because in conferring with the parties, the proposal is to, instead of relying on a new well there, rely on the 2 down gradient wells in those locations and put a soil boring that does not extend down to groundwater, because we don't want to create a new conduit through potential contamination down to groundwater. So we're doing kind of a combination platter there of the existing and new well, both down gradient and a soil boring. So I wanted to clarify that for the record, that those are from OCD's technical review. We believe that those locations are appropriate, and the revision still captures what was represented in OCD's original ask and the order.
Okay. Commissioner Bloom, or did you have any questions yourself?
No, Mr. Chair, I had the opportunity to review the materials prior to the meeting today, and I'm very comfortable with this. Thank you.
As am I. Commissioner Mpoma, any other questions?
No, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So I think we're all in agreement that we're comfortable with these changes. So we'll definitely get the order amended and written up and get it all out for everybody. So we'll do that. Any questions from the parties? Mr. Mullenberg, Mr. Tremaine?
Mr. Chair, no questions. Appreciate your consideration of the revision. And with this, Apache will not be filing an appeal.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Tremaine?
Nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners.
Mr. Chair, just
Yes.
curious, would we need a vote on this?
I think we actually do. I was going to kind of move on to that part, so I agree. So all in favor for the amendment? Aye.
Or Mr. Chair, if you'd allow me, I would move to adopt.
Oh yeah,
the
we need to move
modified
it. Sorry,
agreement.
please. Can we move to adopt it?
And I second.
Excellent. Okay, now all in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Okay, so it is now officially approved. Thank you, Commissioner Bloom. I appreciate it. Okay, excellent. Thank you to all the parties for that. We'll move on to our next case, which is the consolidated cases by Goodnight Midstream and Empire, New Mexico. It's case numbers 24123, 23614 through 17, 23775, 24018 through 24020, and 24025. It is a continuation of an evidentiary hearing. We have our hearing officer and Miss Commissioner Bloom. Thank you. We appreciate it. And we'll get Mr. Lampkin on.
Thank you. And Mr. Lampkin's on his way up. Thank you. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Harwood, we will transfer the hearing over to you.
Thank you, Chairman Rosatos. Good morning, everybody. And I'm assuming, but I'll ask anyway, we do have the court reporter and we are on the record. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Good morning. We're on the record.
All right, great. Okay, we have what I understand is an agreed switch up of witness order at this point. Empire, you're aware of this, right? You guys discussed it with Mr. Rankin.
That's correct. Our understanding is that it'll be Dr. Davidson, followed by Mr. Knights, followed by Mr. Macbeth.
Okay, all right. That's my understanding as well. Okay, let me just remind everybody, put your phones on silent. We don't need to be rudely interrupted by any ducks this week. And so it looks to me like Dr. Davidson is here in person.
Correct, Mr. Hearing Officer.
All right. Doctor, if you raise your right hand.
He's in the back.
Okay.
In the back, but he'll make his way up to the stand now.
All right.
And another point of order, Mr. Hearing Officer, Dr. Davidson did have recent cataract surgery and has been having difficulty. So we have, he's brought printouts of his portions of his slide presentations just so it's easier for him to see and perhaps for the commissioners as well.
Okay. Been there, done that, so I understand perfectly. Good morning, Dr. Davidson. Could you please raise your right hand? You swear and affirm the testimony you give here today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury. All right, Mr. Rankin.
Mr. Davidson, before we proceed, will you make sure that your microphone is turned on? There should be a little button on the stand that it'll.
Now can you hear me?
Now we can. Dr. Davidson, will you please state your name for the record?
James Alexander Davidson,
And by whom are you employed and in what capacity?
Netherlands Sewell and Associates, Senior Technical Advisor in Petrophysics.
Have you previously testified before the Oil Conservation Commission?
I have not.
Can you please give a brief summary of your education?
BS, MS, PhD in Petroleum Engineering, University of Texas for the MS and PhD.
And is your resume attached to your written direct testimony and marked as Exhibit D1?
Yes.
Will you also please give us a brief summary of your work experience as a petroleum engineer and as a petrophysicist, in particular as it relates to your experience working in complex carbonate systems and your experience in and around the Central Basin Platform?
Okay, well, I started about 45 years ago working for Arc Oil and Gas Company. However, previous to that, while I was going to undergraduate school at Texas Tech, I worked part-time for at what was at the time Amoco Oil and Gas Company. Subsequently went away, as did Arco. But in part-time work was involved with Levelland Slaughter Field, where they were evaluating, doing some coring log analysis work, evaluating that field for potential CO2 recovery operations. That was during my undergraduate. I also worked in the summers for Amoco in some of their Permian Central Basin Platform water floods, where they were doing infill drilling and also doing evaluations for CO2, potential CO2 flooding. And that would have been in the Benson Farms, North Cowden, South Cowden, those fields. When I graduated with BS, I went to work for Arco, and my first job was in Midland, Texas, and I was assigned to the North Foster unit and J.L. Johnson AB units. And again, Arco was doing the same thing as everybody else at that time, evaluating their water floods for potential CO2. The reason for that was at that time, there was incentives. There were oil price controls at that time in the early 80s, and there were incentives. If you went to CO2 injection as an EOR project, you got additional dollars for each barrel of oil. So all of the majors at that time were evaluating their water floods, San Andreas Great Bird water floods for CO2. So that was my introduction to this type of work. I worked for Arco for a year there, and then I was transferred to California, and there I worked several conventional water floods, and then moved to Indonesia, where I worked offshore Indonesia and was involved again with a large carbonate, the Bima field. We were doing a evaluation there as log decor and trying to figure out how to map dissolution precipitation fronts, diagenetic, that were affecting the performance of that field. I left Arco and went back to graduate school at University of Texas and got a PhD there. During that time, I worked periodically with the Bureau of Economic Geology And at that time, the Bureau was doing an extensive study of the Grayburg San Andres as far as rock typing and developing petrophysical models and that could be upscaled for reservoir simulation. There was a huge interest in reservoir simulation in the Grayburg San Andres, and this would have been 90 to 98. And at that was the time that Jerry Lucia and Charlie Cairns were doing all their work on the outcrops out here in New Mexico, and a bunch of the work in West Texas, where they were evaluating the different rock types and turning the rock types into reservoir simulation descriptions. And I didn't work directly with Jerry Lucia. I worked with one of his colleagues, Fred Wang. Jerry did the core work, the geology work, and Fred was charged with doing the correlation of well logs to the core work. And they worked together to develop a pretty sophisticated model for a carbonate ramp environments. After I left University of Texas, I went to work for Nell and Sewell and Associates. Been there about 26 years. And we do carbonates all over the world there. I've worked some of the largest carbonates in the world, Northfield and Qatar, Tak and Chimchimal and Iraq. Worked large carbonate discovery in Papua New Guinea. I've done, from the time I joined ARCO in 1998 until about 2019, we did Pemex reserves every year. And during that time, I worked every carbonate reservoir they have in Mexico, and basically described and looked at every core from the carbonate fields in Mexico and the clastics as well. And I've spent quite a bit of time down there in mosquito-infested core facilities, describing cores and building reservoir models from there. So that's the summary of my carbonate experience.
Pretty extensive. Tell the commission a little bit about what Netherlands Sewell and Associates is and what they do and what your role is with them.
We're reserve auditors, reserve consultants. The Security and Exchange Commission requires publicly owned companies to have an independent reserve estimate each year with our SEC filings, and we provide that service for publicly traded companies. We're the largest company that does that. We have more clients for SEC than any other of the major consulting companies. The other thing we do is reserve certification, independent estimates for project financing for large projects. And we work on a lot of the larger projects in the world. For example, the offshore Northwest Australia, Chance, Gorgon. We do reserve certification for the Northfield, which is the giant LNG project in Qatar. We did the certification for the pipeline from Azerbaijan into Europe, which was pinned down by the reserves in the ACG field. And the other thing we do is equities. We do equity when there's equity disputes. We've been involved in some of the largest equities in the world. The largest probably being the Elk Hills National Petroleum Reserve equity dispute between the Department of Energy and Chevron. Our job is to provide independent reserve estimates for the purposes of protecting capital, basically.
Now, in this case in particular, Goodnight Midstream retained you for purposes of this case. Will you explain what it was you were asked to do in this case?
Okay, well, we were asked to provide an independent petrophysical evaluation of the San Andres Grayburg interval, both inside the EMSU, from selected wells inside the EMSU and from wells outside, some of the outside operated water disposal wells, for the purposes of basically determining or estimating oil in place, or not oil in place, but determine whether or not a residual oil zone existed, and whether there were significant amounts of residual oil in the lower San Andres where the disposal operations were going on. The other thing that we were tasked to do was to identify potential flow barriers between the disposal zone and the lower part of the San Andreas and the upper operations in the upper San Andreas and Grayburg where Empire is operating.
So in addition, yeah, so in other words, to look to see if there was, you could identify any potential hydrocarbon reserves, and then also to evaluate whether or not there was a potential for a productive residual zone in that disposal zone where Goodnight's injecting. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And have you then conducted a petrophysical study of the San Andreas in and around the EMSU?
Yes, we have.
And what did you, just at a high level, would you let us know, or the commission know, what it is that you did, what you looked at to come to your opinions?
Well, we looked at all the well logs. We looked at the core data. I did a significant deep dive into the petrophysics of the San Andreas Grayburg and the literature. I had a lot of background from my work at the Bureau of Economic Geology on the type of work that had been done. We drew all that information and into our to build a petrophysical model to evaluate the potential along place and the potential for barriers.
And in the process of doing that, did you you pursued independently your own independent investigation? You went and dug through data on your own and found information.
Yeah, again, I had quite a bit of experience. I was with the Bureau when the outcrop study at the Guadalupe Mountains was being carried out. And the purpose of that study was to build a general model for a carbonate ramp environment that could be applied to any carbonate ramp, anywhere in the world. And so I was there when that work was being done. We relied heavily on that study because it was the San Andreas that they were studying, and specifically they were studying the part of the San Andreas that's in the associated with the disposal zone at below the EMSU. So we relied heavily on that information. We at the time we kind of had a faux pas in a way. I was aware of the 679 core and we studied it extensively. There was also another core that was available. It was for the RR Bell 4. Unfortunately, we discovered that there's two RR Bell 4s associated with the MSU. One of them was drilled sometime in the late 40s, I believe, and one was drilled in the 80s. We found the well that was drilled in the 40s, and the log quality wasn't going to be sufficient for us to do anything, and there seemed to be 100-foot discrepancy in the strapping on the core, so we weren't quite sure where it was within the system. So we kind of used it for the purposes of defining porosity ranges and permeabilities, but we didn't really use that data significantly. We relied more heavily on the 679. I became aware that the RBL was drilled in the 80s and there was a full log sweep for it when we got the rebuttal from the OPS group, and we were able to go out and get that well log, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
So in addition to doing your own investigations, did you also review all the data and information that was provided to you by Empire and Goodnight?
Yes, yes, we did.
And have you prepared written direct rebuttal and sur-rebuttal testimony, exhibits and figures and appendices that are attached to your materials that are marked as Exhibit D, and then your resume is Exhibit D1 that
Yes, I
provide
have.
your opinions and your analyses?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And were the exhibits and figures included in your direct rebuttal and sur-rebuttal testimony prepared by you or under your direction and supervision?
Yes, they were.
Any corrections or changes to the testimony, figures, or exhibits that were filed with the commission?
No.
Dr. Davidson, do you adopt the testimony in the self-affirmed direct testimony, rebuttal testimony, and your sur-rebuttal testimony that's marked as Exhibit D as your sworn testimony today?
I do.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I would at this time tender Dr. Davidson as an expert witness in petroleum engineering and petrophysics.
Any objection, Empire?
Without objection.
OCD?
No objection.
Rice?
No objection.
Pilot?
No objection.
He'll be so recognized.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I'd also move the admission into evidence of Dr. Davidson's direct testimony, his rebuttal testimony, and sur-rebuttal testimony, and the attached exhibits, figures, and appendices that are marked as Exhibit D and his resume as Exhibit D1.
Empire, any objection?
Without objection.
OCD,
No objection.
Rice,
No objection.
Pilot,
No objection.
they will be admitted.
Dr. Davidson, have you been present for or did you listen to the summary testimony, the cross-examination, and redirect testimony provided by Empire's experts during the first and second week of testimony in this proceeding?
I did.
And did you also hear Mr. Macbeth's direct testimony and part of his cross-examination has been conducted to date?
Yes, I did.
And did you prepare summary slides reflecting your up-to-date opinions, including any additional opinions formed based on observing that summary testimony, cross-examination, and redirect testimony from Empire's witnesses during this proceeding?
I did.
Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that Dr. Davidson can review with the commission his opinions. Dr. Davidson, I know you have a hard time seeing on the screen, but you prepared some slides and I'm going to put them up on the screen here. And I'm going to ask you just, if you would, Dr. Davidson, to walk through so the commission understands exactly what you think is most important about this case and are the factors that, in your opinion, should be considered in their assessment and analysis. Okay.
Okay. Ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first slide, just first part is my interpretation interpretation summary. And basically, I wanted to kind of start, I'm going to be using some terms that are associated with the carbonate ramp environment and the different rock types. We feel like it's very important to understand the petrophysical characteristics of the different rock types present in the petrophysical modeling process. And basically what this is just showing is a cartoon of a carbonate ramp environment. And I'll try to get through this pretty rapidly. In the high energy, where there's a lot of wave energy at the top of a system, it's where the coarser grain sediments, carbonate sediments, reside. And those are generally described as grainstones, relatively large grains, very little mud content. You move down where the wave energy is a little bit lower, and you get into what's called a grain-dominated packstone. And what that is coarse grains with some mud material, carbonate mud material, mud being not clastic mud, but mud-sized particles, which is very small grain carbonate sediments, and they start mixing together. You get a little deeper in the system and you get into something called a mud-dominated packstone, and that's where the volume of mud exceeds the volume of the coarser grains. And then when you get even deeper into the system, you get into something called a whackistone, and there the mud grains are almost totally dominate the grain system. And then at the bottom of the system in the deep water, you usually have lime mud. And again, this is mud in terms of grain size, very, very small grain sizes. And in an environment where the sea level is changing it, or there's subsidence and uplift, you can get these different this depositional system stacked on top of one another. So when you drill a well, sometimes you drill through several sequences that represent different pieces of this carbonate ramp. And typically what happens is you move deeper in the system, you get higher gamma ray readings, because gamma ray in this environment is dominated by uranium content, and uranium absorbs onto the grains, and the smaller the grain size, the larger the surface area for the uranium to absorb upon. So the gamma ray grows up. The other thing that happens is in a shallow water environment, for example, where I'm showing the grainstones, you have high wave energy, and in that environment, the uranium content is typically pretty low. So we use the uranium curve, the gamma ray curve very extensively to kind of tell us where we are in the depositional environment. It's basically an indicator of mud content. The grains get smaller, the permeability typically decreases the deeper you get in the ocean, deeper you move into the ocean. And with the higher mud content, the grain size is smaller, and the permeabilities typically go down, and the reservoir quality goes down. So we're very cognizant of the different rock types when we're trying to do an evaluation in a carbonate ramp field. Just go to the next slide. Okay, so this is the first thing we have to do is get an understanding of what the core data is telling us. And one of the problems that you have with with conventional core is when you cut the core, you're cutting it at reservoir pressure, and then you're bringing it up to surface. And as the pressure is released, the gas expands in the oil, and some oil and water are expelled. We have to be cognizant of that when we look at the surface oil and water saturations that are reported in the core reports. The other thing that happens is as the gas expands out of the oil, the volume of oil shrinks due to the loss of the gas, and that's the shrinkage. So we have bleeding and shrinkage. And then the other thing that occurs in a conventional reservoir is when you're coring with water, oil is flushed from the near wellbore area. However, in this situation, that's not that big of a problem because the core was drilled in a residual oil zone. So arguably, the oil is going to be relatively immobile. It's not going to be flushed. Now, we still have the bleeding, we still have the shrinkage, but we're probably not going to have much flushing. Now, there's another loss mechanism that's been discussed earlier in this hearing. I think it was referred to as super flushing, and the more correct term for that is stripping. And that has to do with the fact that when you have a high pressure at the coring bit and low pressure in the formation, sometimes you can get high velocity water movement at the bit that can strip oil out of the rock due to very high viscous drag forces due to the high pressure differentials. However, we did an analysis on that, and the permeabilities in the matrix at EMSU, at least in the 679 core and the RL core, were too low. It takes permeabilities in excess, roughly a Darcy or higher, for stripping to occur, and we just don't have that much rock. That most of our rocks are in the tens of millidarcies to 1 Darcy range, and so the stripping we did the modeling to check that what was it present. We came to the conclusion it wasn't, so we concentrated on the shrinkage and the bleeding, and originally, I used a little rule of thumb that was developed by Jake Rathmel out of the ARCO Research Center for use when I started in the industry, there was a big push to try to evaluate fields very rapidly for potential CO2. And our research department developed some simplified procedures that we could use to correct the core data so that we could, evaluate in-place volumes and determine whether or not we potentially had a CO2 project that could follow a water flood. So I use that little rule of thumb method, and I got some pushback on that during my verbal testimony. It seemed that the implication was it was too simplistic, and that a more rigorous approach might be needed. So I went back and did the full rigorous evaluation. What we did is we took data from where we had pressure core data from Seminole San Andres and the Maljmar field up to the north, and we looked at the oil properties, the gas content, initial gas content at minimum reservoir pressure. We looked at viscosities. We looked at oil gravities at those two locations. And then we moved out, at those two locations, we actually had pressure core data where we had a pretty good idea of what the shrinkage and the bleeding values actually were. And we actually had core measurements where those could be quantified. And we took that data and we moved it back to the conditions that exist in the EMSU. And you have to realize that as you move off the central part of the Central Basin Platform toward the edges, either the east or the west edges, the oil properties tend to degrade. For example, EMSU up in the Grayburg, the gravity was on the order of 30, 31 degree API, whereas at Seminole, it's 35 to 38 degree API. And so you have to take those changes into account. The other thing you have to take into account is changes in the gravity resulting from going below the producing oil water contact. And at Seminole, they found that the oil gravity went from roughly 35 down to about 27 degree API below the oil water contact. That's very common, but it has to be taken into account that the 679 core was taken below the producing oil water contact. And basically, when I went through the mathematics to kind of figure out what the gravity was, what you'd expect, it was below the contact. It was about 26 degree, not the 31 degree that Grayburg oil at original conditions above the contact was measured at. The other thing that happens is the viscosity goes up. And so we took the viscosity data at Seminole and also the viscosity data at Maljamar, and we corrected that back to the EMSU conditions. And what we found was that the viscosities for example, the viscosity below the oil water contact at EMSU was roughly 3 times the viscosity that they had observed below the oil water contact in Seminole. And bleeding is directly proportional. This is some work that was done by Jack Rathmill at the time I was working with ARCO in the research company. Bleeding is directly proportional to the gas content. And we found that the gas content gas content depends on the amount the reservoir has been depleted prior to the initiation of the CO2. And we had some pressure measurements that were available, MDT measurements that kind of defined a range of potential reservoir pressures at the location of the 679 core, and we evaluated that whole range. But long story short, the gas content of the oil below the oil water contact at EMSU was roughly maybe 60% of what it was below the oil water contact at Seminole. So the bleeding is directly proportional to the gas content, inversely proportional to the viscosity of the fluid. The higher the viscosity, the less bleeding you get. The higher the gas content, the more bleeding you get. So we had to make all those corrections back to EMSU conditions. And we came up with a range so then there's also, you have to do the B sub O calculations, which are directly proportional gas content as well. So we went back and we took the original B sub O, we used the Grayburg B sub O, and then we corrected it to bottom hole conditions, considering a range of potential pressure drawdowns prior to the coring of that well. And long story short, the final correction factor kind of varied between, when we lumped all that stuff together, varied from about 1.1 to about 1.25. And if we assume that there'd been no pressure drop at all in the San Andres, in other words, it had never experienced any pressure drop, then that 1.25 became 1.3. And the little Jake Rathmill rule of thumb gave me a correction factor of 1.22, which seems to fit pretty well within that 1.1 to 1.25 range. So we were pretty comfortable that we didn't need to make any changes to our original core corrections. Okay, go to the next slide. Then the next thing to do was to identify the different rock types that were available in that 679 core. And basically what I did there was use a rock typing procedure that was developed by the Jerry Lucia, basically at the Bureau of Economic Geology. And it was the major data for that at the time. That procedure has undergone an evolution with time as Jerry learned more and more about St. Andrews and Grayburg. But the interesting thing is he developed an original version of that cross-plotting technique with the lower San Andreas at that outcrop, which is exactly where we're evaluating the core, for the MSU. So I was able to go back and use his cross-plotting technique to identify the different rock types that were present in the core. So we did that. And so now I've identified the grain stones, the pack stones, the grain dominated, pack stones, the mud dominated pack stones, the wax stones. We were able to identify each of those in the core. And then the next thing that you have to do is we don't have core in every well, so I have to be able to identify or predict the different types of rock facies present using the well log measurements. And we did that. Of course, we have the well log measurements we can use. We use the gamma ray, density, neutron porosity measurements. If we have sonic, which is great, that provides very important data. And the other thing that we brought to bear was a modeling process developed by George Asquith out of Texas Tech University, where you basically calculate an estimate of what the porosity of the rock is from the shallow resistivity measurements. And then by comparing that resistivity-based porosity estimate to the actual porosity, you can determine kind of whether you're in a unimodal pore system or a multimodal pore system, and that helps you in a buggy environment. And when you have something like a mud mixed with a grain stone, you have a multimodal pore system. So using that porosity, you can kind of start developing a model on differentiating, for example, between a grain stone and a grain dominated pack stone and a mud dominated pack stone. So we use that information. The other thing that we use is the uranium content. That tells us something about the depositional environment. And then the other thing that we found that was very useful were looking at shallow, medium, and deep resistivity measurements and evaluating the invasion characteristics. And we were able to see that by looking at the invasion characteristics, that the different rock types had different invasion characteristics into the formation. So we brought that to bear in the rock typing. Now, the other thing that we used, and I didn't discuss here, but because most of the wells in the EMSU, at least the ones that we were given to evaluate, didn't have sonic measurements, which I found to be quite unusual. But that was the hand we were dealt. Now, the wells some of the wells that we were given, the disposal wells outside the MSU, did have sonic data. And Jerry Lucia built a very comprehensive model when you have sonic measurements to do rock typing based on looking at the volume of calculated bugs to the total porosity. And they've done quite a bit of work at the outcrop study where they were actually able to kind of tie that what's called the VPR, the bug to total porosity ratio, to rock typing and permeability. And so we were able to adopt that model. And that was actually a pretty neat thing because it gave us a way to do rock typing without having to look at all this invasion profile and all these other things. It's kind of an automatic. And it's a really nice model. The problem that we had with it, we could only apply it on the wells that we weren't really interested in. But on the other hand, what we were able to do, because we had the highest confidence in the model that had the sonic measurements, we were able to take our model that we developed without the sonic, run it through the wells where we had the sonic, and see did we get the same kind of distribution of facies, the same type of oil saturations, the same porosity. So that's we went through a process where we iterated through that and to ensure that our model was predictive in a situation where we didn't have a sonic. And why is that important? It's because up in the area where the core was drilled, there wasn't that much, but there was bug porosity, but it wasn't as high as it is deep in that disposal zone. When you get into the disposal zone, the bug porosity, karsting stuff starts becoming very significant. And we were very concerned that our model be predictive when we got to very high bug porosities because we didn't have it in the core. So it's very important for us to have a model that we could take to that lower San Andreas and have decent predictions of oil volumes in the area where the bug porosity was higher. We found that the model did match when we would run what we call the no sonic model in the wells where we had sonic and compare it to the sonic porosity, water saturation, oil saturation calculations. They agreed very well. At that point, we felt like we had a predictive model. Now, since that time, we've had the opportunity, particularly at Maljamar, where we have a sonic and sonic measurements, a pressure core where we have the highest confidence in the oil saturations and porosities. And we were able to run our sonic and no sonic model, on that well, and we got a really good match to the core measurements. So we felt, at the end of the day, we felt very comfortable that our model was predictive in all environments.
Now, the Maljamar well that you're referring to, that's the 522 well, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And just to
No, it's not. 522 is the north well. It's the 358 Maljamar, I think, is the one in the Maljamar field.
Thank you for correcting me. And just so it's clear, you prepared two models, one petrophysical models, one that employed the sonic data and another that followed the Jerry Lucia approach, correct?
They're both Jerry Lucia approaches. It's one of them works without sonic. It depends on a facies model. The other one is pretty much the Jerry Lucia model that employs the sonic is pretty much an automatic rock typing model. As soon as you have the sonic measurements, you calculate the bug porosity ratio. You can pretty well, it figures out the rock types for you and assigns the parameters that we can do the saturation calculation.
Now, Dr. Davidson, before we move off the slide, you heard some criticism of your approach from the petrophysicists with Ops Geologic criticizing you that you did not evaluate or you excluded certain rock types from your assessment. Can you just address that?
Our model, all rock types are available in every interval, and I can talk a little bit later on why that appears to be so to somebody who's not familiar with our modeling. But all rock types are available. The upper and lower San Andreas contain grainstones. The upper and lower San Andreas and Graybird contain wax stones. They contain mudstones. All rock types are present. It's just that there's a change that occurs in the lower San Andreas where you change the depositional environment where some of the better quality rock types are less prevalent than are present up in the Grayberg Formation. It appears that the Grayberg Formation was pretty high energy environment its entire life. But in the upper San Andreas to some extent, and we call the lower San Andreas, and I'll show you that distinction here shortly. It appears that it was more cyclical, where we have high energy, high frequency sequences. Sea level changes were happening pretty rapidly, and rock types were changing pretty rapidly, and as a result, the relative amount of, for example, the good quality grainstones is lower as you get deeper in the system, and I'll go over that shortly.
Okay. Next slide.
Okay, now this is important, I think, for several reasons, because what it's showing, this is the data from the outcrop study, and the outcrop study occurred at the Guadalupe Mountain outcrop to the west of EMSU. I think it's maybe 60, 80, 100 miles away, but it's the San Andreas section outcrops, and they're able actually to get in. And when you do an outcrop study, you have to go in and kind of dig off the surface rock, get deep into the rock to get some of the things that are ruined by weather out of the way. And so you can actually kind of see what the reservoir rock looks like. The point I wanted to make on here was in the better quality rock, let's talk about the grainstones, the grain dominated pack stones. Those are generally considered to have the better quality. there's not that big of a porosity range. We're only talking, maybe 10 to 14% for the better quality rocks. However, you see there's like an order of magnitude or more change in the permeability. It's incredibly important to be able to distinguish between the different types of rocks, and porosity is not the proper way to do it. And the other interesting thing here, they found that in general, until you got to the situation where you're actually developing karst, where you have connected vug porosity, the presence of vugs, when porosity increases, it's generally as a result of the presence of vugs. And the interesting thing here is the presence of vugs doesn't necessarily mean higher porosity, doesn't necessarily mean higher rock quality. And that's a very important thing to consider. And ultimately what happens is the vugs, as vugs are created in dissolution precipitation experiments, so you dissolve the material out of the rock to make a vug, but then at some point that dissolved material gets reprecipitated, and you actually wind up in many cases with lower permeability associated with a higher porosity. Now, in the situation where we'll talk about later, where we have huge throughput of meteoric fluids and H2S counterflow and all that. Now we're creating connected vug networks in karst, and that's a whole different ballgame. But for the purposes of what we're talking about right now, I just wanted to point out that porosity in and of itself is not a good indicator of rock quality.
Okay. You mentioned the term vugs, and we've heard that, I think, throughout the testimony earlier. Will you just explain what it is, a vug is, just at a high level? So well,
what happens, a lot of times you'll have, for example, a simple example is you'll have a critter shell, a shell from some sort of a sea animal. And sometimes it's usually a limestone calcite based thing. Well, acidic fluid coming through, a high pH fluid coming through will actually dissolve that shell out and leave a hole where the where the shell actually was. And then that water migrates through, and then later on, ultimately the water becomes supersaturated in calcium carbonate, and it reprecipitates out. So a lot of times what you'll see, for example, you'll see bugs, and then there may be fractures nearby, and water will migrate into those fractures, and those fractures will become calcite filled as that calcium carbonate comes out of solution. And sometimes it includes porosity, the pore throat, sometimes it includes fractures. But in general, what they found at the outcrop, at least, was increased porosity due to increased vug content didn't necessarily mean increased permeability and increased reservoir problem.
So the vugs are the voided space.
The voids, big voids in there.
Got it. Okay, let's go to your next slide.
And here's kind of, we're kind of jumping ahead, but what I wanted to show here is a situation. I'm plotting what's called the resistivity index, which is just the deep resistivity. RI, the RI is the deep resistivity measurements divided by the resistivity of 100% water-filled rock. And that's a typical thing that you do with any petrophysical model. But what I'm showing here is the RI derived from the core measurements and the log measurements of deep resistivity versus the water saturation derived from the core measurements. Now here, because we didn't use the water saturations from the core, because if as I told you, what happens when you bring the core out is you expel water. And for example, the cores for 679, for example, if you add the oil and the water up, you only come up with about 66% of the core space, of the pore space. So, in a situation where you're below an oil water contact, you would expect the core to be completely full of fluid. Well, it's not full of fluid anymore, because when we brought it to surface, gas expanded and we expelled the water and we expelled oil. I don't pay much attention to the water, but I know I can correct if I know enough about the permeability, the characteristics of the rock, the characteristics of the oil, I can correct the oil saturations back to a fairly decent representation of what they were back downhole. So what we did here, the water saturations that are reported here are basically 1 minus the corrected oil saturation, because that would have been the water saturation we would expect it in a residual oil zone at bottom hole conditions. So then Archie models have been used here, for example. Original model, I think that NewTek used they used an Archie-like model. It's a Siemens-Dole model, but in a situation where there's not much shale and there's not much shale in the system, Siemens-Dole basically reduced to Archie. And I think OPS used an Archie-type model as well. And what you typically do is you plot the data up, and then you find the data will typically fall on a slope on one of these cross plots. And I plotted on there, for example, the n equal 2 line, and you see that almost all of the core data falls above that. So n equal 2 is not a very decent representation. And then I think Trentham and Melzer have recommended for this San Andreas maybe somewhere in the 2.3 to 3.4 range for n. So I plotted that line on here, what that line would look like. And you see again, there's some data that falls on that line, but there's still quite a bit of data that falls to the right of the line. So when we saw this, and again, each rock type kind of falls on its own. So what we wound up doing was using an alternate model that was developed by Schlumberger for oil wet reservoirs, and this is an oil wet reservoir, that uses a different equation and a parameter called a critical saturation. And the critical saturation lines you see here are those little curved lines that kind of that you see above the n equal 2 line, the little curvilinear lines. What we wound up doing was taking each rock type, plotting each rock type independently on this plot, and then fitting one of those lines, those what we call SC lines, to each rock type. So you see for the grainstone, there's which is the G on this plot. There, the grainstone points, we used the grainstone points and we fit a line to it. Then we went to the grain-dominated packstone. We just plotted those points alone, and then we fit a curve to those lines. Then we did the mud-dominated packstone. We fit the SC model to that one, and that way we built a model where if we could identify the rock type, we could actually use that rock type and the SC value that represented that rock type and the equation in the bottom left here to calculate the water saturation. And the beauty of this is it takes all the data into account. And as long as we can reasonably identify the rock type, we can reasonably estimate what the water saturation is. That was the calibration procedure. We use this calibrated data in both the sonic and non-sonic models.
Dr. Davidson, you mentioned that you don't pay much attention to the water saturation in the core. Just if you would just briefly touch on why that is.
Well, it's hard to.
I do have a quasi-objection point. So Mr. Macbeth was first, and that went over an hour and a half. This is a 30 slide deck presentation. We're at slide 6 and we're over 30 minutes in at slide 6. I think the longest Empire presentation was Mr. West at the end, maybe an hour and a half. To the comments that came from Friday, we have no problem with a little bit of leeway off of kind of the rough parameters set for direct, but I mean, this is going to be a 2.5, 3 hour direct examination at this pace. And this is not the way that Empire understood the proceedings were working procedurally.
Mr. Rankin?
Well, Empire has 11 witnesses. We have 3 fewer. It is a very complex issue. I think I'll leave it to the commission. We can curtail and just got a high, I can ask Dr. Davidson to go a little bit at a higher level. I do think it's helpful for the commission, and the commission can tell us what their pleasure is to understand exactly how Dr. Davidson did his analysis, so it's understood. I think the bottom line in this case is understanding whether and to what extent there is oil down here, and this analysis that Dr. Davidson is presenting explains that, how he came to his determination. It's a lot of this is in his written testimony. It's true. It's complex, and I can ask Dr. Davidson to kind of, at a slightly higher level, discuss it. But I leave it to the commission. If this is helpful for them, then I'm happy to have Dr. Davidson continue at this level, or if not, then we can go at a slightly higher level. But I'll just say, we had I did not object at all to any of the timeframes that Empire put forward with their witnesses. And they did have 11, and we just have 8. So it's not, they had 2 separate sets of petrophysicists presenting information, and we just have 1.
May I be heard briefly in reply?
Sure.
So the number of witnesses doesn't matter. Secondly, with respect to the examination here, I am hopeful for Mr. Macbeth and Dr. Davidson that, given that Mr. Rankin is spending all this time, that there wouldn't be any redirect, because he's covered everything in detail. Additionally, with respect to the witness statements, Dr. Davidson, I know y'all are reading and preparing for these things. I'm not making fun here. It's quite loquacious. I think we have over 120 pages of direct witness testimony out of Dr. Davidson, including him being able to submit a SIR rebuttal for 3 rounds. So again, we're just trying to keep some reins on this, because we're running out of the weeks that are allotted for the proceeding. And at this pace, we're going to be here a very, very long time.
Well, there's some merit to the quasi objection. I mean, what I'm hearing from the witnesses is a lot of narrative. Now, I understand there needs to be some leeway, because frankly, it's also technical that it's way over my head. But there is some merit to the objection. I would ask that you that you make sure that the answers are responsive to the questions, and to the extent possible, avoid these long narrations.
Sure, I understand. I'll work with Dr. Davidson to direct his testimony more succinctly.
Okay, thank you. And, to be fair to everybody, I mean, all of this is in the record already in written sworn testimony. So, and these are high-level people you're talking to. If you were explaining it to me, you could be here for days. Sure. But you're not. You're explaining it to a highly sophisticated technical audience.
Most of this is in the record. That's true, Mr. Hearing Officer. There are some elements that I think Dr. Davis would like to address that are particularly responsive to the arguments and issues that have arisen, and I'll ask him to try to focus his recitals on those issues as we go forward.
That's fair enough, and I'll be listening for objections that the witnesses' answers are narrative.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. So anything further on this particular side, Dr. Davidson, in terms of how you came up with your petrophysical model to address each of the rock types?
No.
Okay. If you would just explain what this next slide shows and how it relates to your analysis with respect to the 679 core.
Okay, well, at the end of the day, the goal is to get a good match to the core data. And so this is a match of our non-sonic model to the core measurements. In the right hand, you see that the last 2 tracks to the right are porosity and oil saturation. And we feel like we did a fairly decent job of matching the core measurements. In fact, if you take the oil saturation at each point and sum it up, our model over-predicted hydrocarbon pore volume by about 4%, but we felt pretty comfortable that we'd done a reasonable job matching the core measurements. Hopefully that's short enough for you, everybody.
Next slide here, Dr. Davidson, looking at the RR Bell 4, you also went back.
Okay, as I said, we didn't realize early on that the RR Bell had open hole well log measurements that were reasonable enough for us to use. Ultimately, after we saw the ops rebuttal, we found that there were raster images for the RR Bell logs. So we digitized the chord section, ran our model blind against the core measurements, and this is the result. And again, we felt that our model did a reasonable job for predicting the porosities and the oil saturations from the RRBL. And again, I hope that was fast enough for everybody. Let's move on.
Next slide here, you're addressing the Maljamar core that you referred to briefly with me previously, the MCA 358. Explain what this shows with respect to your analysis regarding the corrected.
This was an example. Again, this is when we got this data and evaluated late in the evaluation phase. And Maljamar, the neat thing about that well, it was drilled and cored with a pressure core, which gives us the very best estimates of the oil saturations. They can be corrected very accurately back to reservoir conditions. And what I'm showing here is the results from both of our models. The sonic model, well, where you can utilize the sonic data, in the model where we don't have the sonic data. And you see that both models, in my view at least, did a fairly decent job of matching the actual core oil saturation measurements. And again, we just ran the model as it was against this well, and we ran both models, the sonic, non-sonic model. Now, it's not perfect, but we got a fairly decent match, at least order of magnitude, of the oil saturations for this well. Okay. Go.
And if you would, just next slide here, explain to the commission your understanding of what an ROZ is and how it would apply to your assessment.
We modeled this ROZ for the EMSU using this definition. It's oil remaining in a column below a trap that has been swept by vertical or horizontal flow to establish a shallow oil water contact. In our understanding, that's what 679 represented, and that was what the ROZ in the EMSU was represented, where oil had been swept out of the interval below the current oil water contact, and we were modeling it as a residual oil zone. Now, the other thing that we're showing down here, this is data that BEG did, published for the Seminole unit, where they'd gone in and for each rock type that I described, they kind of described what a residual saturation would look like. So for example, what if a zone well had, or an interval had originally been full of oil and been swept, what kind of residual oil would you expect? And looking at that, it seems like, well, we would expect to see maybe 25 to 40 saturation units of oil in a residual oil zone. And so that's kind of what we would be looking for.
Okay. And just so it's clear, this is the basis for your assessment about whether or not, or to what extent, the disposal zone that Goodnight's injecting into would qualify as a potential residual oil zone.
Yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about the profiles here shortly. Okay. And again, I'm trying to speed up as best I can.
So this next slide here, I think, it goes further into this analysis, and you got it up on your paper here. Explain what this shows and why this is, in your opinion, critical to your assessment of the ROZ and the EMSU.
And what we're showing here is the 746 well. This is our interpretation of 746 well. To the right, I'm showing a well log from the Seminole San Andres unit. And unfortunately, has decided to hold the cored well and the core information for Seminole as being confidential. However, we were able to find a well that was drilled as part of the ROZ development plan from Seminole. And so we went in and just ran our model blind against that well. And what you see there on the right-hand side is the Seminole well, and on the right track is the oil saturations. And interestingly enough, we were able to duplicate down there. There's an MPZ which had been CO2 flooded for about 40 years. And you see the residual saturations there, oil saturations on the order of 20%. You get down below the main production zone into what they classified as the ROZ, and we have oil saturations. And again, if you look at there, the we kind of have a wall that's relatively flat, about 45%. So we see the residuals kind of like we would expect to see based on what we got out of the BEG for what the residual saturations would be. So if we move to the left, this is we see the results from our calculations for 746. Why is 746 important? Because it goes all the way through from the Grayburg all the way to the Glorietta. So we're going through the disposal zone in this well. And what you see is what the Grayburg area and what you guys would call the upper, or we would call the upper San Andres, does have what it appears to be, something that approaches what an ROZ would look like. It looks very similar to the what's the ROZ over in the Seminole San Andres. However, if we get below that, you see there's a little bit of oil that shows up in the disposal zone in the interval below that. But the point is the profiles just aren't the same. You get little wisps here and there, and there's 100 feet between them. Yes, there's little bits of oil down in that disposal zone. We think those are probably more likely paleo migration pathways, not ROZs.
Objection narrative.
I allowed Ms. Hardy to testify with her witnesses on direct. I've asked him to explain why this is critical to his analysis, and he's explaining it.
Overruled.
Okay. I'll try to make this as short as possible. We think the disposal zone, the oil in the disposal zone predominantly consists of abandoned paleo migration paths. We think that the target, if there is one for CO2 injection, exists in the Grayburg, and maybe the upper part of the San Andres above what I call the gamma ray marker there, where the very high gamma ray below where the high oil saturations are. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide that's very important is we're moving west to east, and the top of the San Andres goes, and even using Mr. Waymeyer's definition of how to pick the top of the San Andres, we go from 400 feet down to 1,800 feet for the top of the San Andres. I'm just pointing out that going west to east, the San Andres is down dipping.
But before we move off this, Dr. Davidson, you explained that this profile in the EMSU 746 is indicative to you of a potential for a migratory pathway. As compared to the profile you're seeing in the Seminole San Andres unit. Well, can you explain to me or tell the commission why it is that you believe that this profile in the EMSU 746 within the disposal zone indicated here is more indicative of a oil migratory pathway rather than a zone that had been previously saturated with oil?
Because the oil saturations, when we can't calculate them to be present, are generally under 20%. And the oil that does show up where we do have oil saturations tends to be in the grainstones. And what happens when oil migrates, it migrates through the best quality rock. And then all rock has some level of high permeability pathways, at least part way. So oil, when it's migrating, small saturations can get into some of the poorer quality rock, but the highest oil saturations tend to reside in the best quality rock. And you never really build a trap in a migration path. And then if there's subsequent fluid flushing, the intervals that have very low saturation, say sub 20, the saturation doesn't change much, but the saturation, you do wind up with the residual in the better quality rock, and you don't get that nice flat profile of high residual saturations that you see in the EMSU 746 up to the Grayburg and the SSAU well down in the San Andres. It's just a different profile. Okay. The saturation profile is just different. Now we're going to talk about tall cotton. I've heard the interval below the oil water contact in the Grayburg in EMSU described as both a greenfield ROZ and a brownfield ROZ. So I don't know which one Empire actually believes it is, but I went to look for what assuming that Seminole is defined as a brownfield ROZ where you have a trap below an existing oil column, Tall Cotton was described as a greenfield ROZ where you have an ROZ that's not associated with a trap. So I wanted to look at what does the profile of an ROZ look like in a greenfield. So we can go to the next slide. And this is, again, we ran our model blind against the Tall Cotton. Unfortunately, Kinder Morgan, like Hess, held the core data and the log data for the Cordwell confidential, so we weren't able to get that. But I was able to find one of the development wells for Tall Cotton, and we ran our model there. And again, you can see that we have that, kind of a flat 40% front for 100 feet or more, where it defines what I would consider an expected profile for a residual oil zone. And again, 20 to 40% residual saturations based on kind of what they found at the BEG. Go to the next slide. And this is the out of, I think, Mr. Melzer's or Dr. Trentham's paper where they're showing core data in an ROZ. This may be Seminole, it may be Goldsmith, I don't know for sure. But what they're showing, again, is a 20 to 40% oil saturation range through the ROZ. Now, to the left here is the core data from, and these are the corrected core points for EMSU 679. And we're kind of not seeing that same kind of profile. We have a few feet there that kind of get up into the 40% range, 40, 50% range, but it just doesn't look to me like an ROZ. However, it doesn't matter what I think. Empire wants to go and flood this. That's their prerogative. My argument is that what's going on deeper in the San Andres, below what I call the high gamma ray marker, it isn't going to. The injection operations on there aren't going to affect their operations up in the shallow part of the ROC.
Just to be clear, Dr. Davison, you referenced that this chart on the left-hand side of your exhibit here shows the corrected core values for the 679 and the EMSU well. Those are the core corrections based on your analysis, correct? Yes, sir. What were the core corrections that you came up with for the EMSU 679?
Well, at the end of the day, the correction factor was about 1.22. For the pressure range present, it could vary between 1.1 and 1.3.
Okay, thank you. This next slide here, if you would just explain, you mentioned this previously, and as you were discussing your rock typing and understanding the system here, explain how you determined how this gamma ray plot helped you evaluate and determine rock typing in your analysis for the EMSU.
Well, basically, once you do this for a while, and it's important to realize that the gamma ray here is associated predominantly by uranium. There's not a whole lot of clay minerals in this rock that affect the gamma ray. So what we're actually seeing is variations in uranium. And like I said, uranium deposits based on surface area and wave energy. Up at the top, above what I call the gamma ray marker, you see the gamma ray baseline is pretty low. Those are the grainstones. Those are the that's a high energy environment. And you notice above that high gamma ray marker, the rock is predominantly deposited in a high energy environment. That's the upper San Andres Grayberg interval that we're talking about. Then you get what I call the high gamma ray marker. Below that, you see there's a discernible shift to the right of the minimum gamma ray measurements. And that's indicating higher surface area, which is indicating higher mud content. And when you have higher mud content, that's indicating poorer reservoir rock quality. And so what we did is we found what we found is a gamma ray level that above the baseline that would return the proper grainstone interpretation up in the Grayberg. Then we use that shifted gamma ray baseline to identify the grainstones below that high gamma ray marker. So we do have grainstones in that deeper section, but what it's telling me is as we move deeper in that section, I'm getting higher and higher mud content, meaning the reservoir quality as we get deeper in the section is deteriorating. Now, what you have down there below that high gamma ray marker, there's a little spiky interval, and then there's an interval where the gamma ray kind of settles down, maybe about 4275 and down, and that's the interval where we see the karsting in the lower San Andreas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, we go from an interval above that marker that's predominantly high energy to an interval below where we have high frequency sequences and we're getting lower and lower energy deposition. And ultimately, we get into where we're actually starting to see deep water deposition, more mudstone, waxstone type deposition. And that would be the porous reservoir quality.
Mr. Rankin, would this be a good time to take a mid-morning break? It's 10:31.
I think that's just fine, Mr. Hearing Officer. We'll take a mid-morning break.
Okay, let's be back at 10:45. Thanks. Are we ready in the back, Ms. Apodaca?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, Madam Court Reporter, can we go back on the record?
Yes, sir.
All right. Mr. Rankin.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. I think we're on slide number 16 of Dr. Davidson's presentation, a summary of his testimony. Dr. Davidson, this next slide, number 16, if you would explain how this slide reflects your analysis regarding the presence of anhydrites through the lower St. Andrews zone that you analyzed.
This basically we identified what I've called a high gamma ray marker. As I stated previously, what we see is below that marker, there's a marked shift in the minimum gamma ray values above those that are present up in the gray bird. Then what you see in the gamma ray track are very spiky gamma rays, and those gamma ray spikes typically correspond to low porosity intervals and many times high resistivity intervals. And we interpret those to be bedded anhydrites that are associated with a very high frequency depositional environment where we're basically probably prograding out into the ocean. We're moving from maybe a ramp crest to maybe the outer ramp. We're still getting some good quality rock being deposited, but then when the sea level falls, we get evaporites forming on the exposed rock. And when you evaporate seawater, you concentrate uranium. So that's the little gamma ray spikes you see below there are where we've concentrated uranium. And then if you go to the right track, and I think I'm colorblind, but I think the color is purple. We've kind of identified the anhydrite intervals or intervals with elevated anhydrite as being purple. And then the other thing we did is we went back to make sure that we had this right. We went back and used a cross-plating technique that Jerry Lucia developed to identify anhydrites that hadn't been altered by any kind of diagenesis. So a bedded anhydrite wouldn't be altered by diagenesis. And we would expect in bedded anhydrite, we'd expect to see elevated gamma ray, we'd expect it to be unaltered, and we expect to see an elevated presence of anhydrite. So basically that's that interval below what I call the high gamma ray marker consists of a high frequency sequence where there were multiple sea level changes, and we actually did have fairly good quality rock deposited because we're in a relatively high energy environment, but then they're capped by these intervals where the rock gets elevated above sea level, and we're able to create some evaporites and create laminated bedded anhydrites. Now, these bedded anhydrites will be very good barriers.
Dr. Davidson, were you able to corroborate your interpretation of these anhydrates with literature?
Yeah, and actually, Dr. Trenham describes this process as being part of the upper part of the lower St. Andrews, this high frequency depositional environment with the capping of evaporites at the top of each sequence. So I'm not the only person that's identified this. Dr. Trentham has described this depositional environment in the upper part of the lower St. Andrews as well. And I'm defining the lower St. Andrews. I'm not a geologist, and I don't care to become one, to be honest with you, but I'm defining the lower St. Andrews as the St. Andrews interval below the what I call the high gamma ray marker.
Thank you. This next slide here, Dr. Davidson goes into, I think, some more detail about your analysis of these anhydrites. If you would just explain what this shows and how it reflects your analysis and determination of the existence of these anhydrites across the EMSU area.
So I had a relatively limited data set, and a lot of the logs that I wanted to have access to, we couldn't get in public available sites like Drilling Info and the OCG. What I did was able to do after we got the ops rebuttal, they had access to a whole lot more well logs than I did. And so we were able to get some well logs that penetrated through the Grayburg and a good part of the upper part of what I call the lower San Andreas. And we were able to do mineralogy interpretations on those. And then I also went through the cross plotting technique that Jerry Lucia developed to identify the bedded anhydrites. And what I found was there's an interval, and again, the top line there on that yellow shaded area, I connect the dots between what I call the high gamma ray marker, and then below that, if you see the little flags next to the death track, those are the intervals where we identify the bedded anhydrites. And what this is, I believe, a northwest southeast cross section through the EMSU, and you can see that there's an interval of bedded anhydrites that exist all the way across the field. And in my opinion, at least, these would provide, and again, the majority of the injection, as I understand it, in the disposal wells are occurring below this interval that I've highlighted in the yellow there. So in my view, the injection interval is isolated from the upper San Andreas above what I call the high gamma ray marker by several layers of bedded anhydrites. The other thing on here that you can see is the porosity associated below that marker is quite a bit higher, indicating quite a bit of dissolution has occurred, and that's probably as a result of the muric water and the H2S migration that Dr. Lindsay and Dr. Trenham and Melzer have hypothesized.
So I think the next series of slides, Dr. Davison, specifically go to items identified in your rebuttal testimony, responding to new tech specifically, and I believe also ops geologic. If you would just explain what this slide shows and how, I think it's information from Dr. Melzer and Dr. Trentham's assessment of ROZs. Explain how this relates to your rebuttal and what you have to say, your critique in response to Empire's petrophysical analysis.
Well, and again, this is going to be my critique of Trentham and Melzer as well. They've published kind of what they call a cookbook on how to identify ROZs. And, this is based on, I think, either a 4 or 8 county study. And they've kind of defined M&N values for the Archie model. They define water resistivities to use and kind of tell you where am I in on the Central Basin platform, and after I know my location, how should I do the petrophysical calculation? And in my opinion, and it's using the Archie model, and I'm talking a few minutes about why the Archie model in any of its any way that it's presented is not the right type of model to use for this environment. But I think what the thing that bothers me is I can apply this cookbook approach, and I can find an ROZ almost anywhere. But the disturbing thing is I almost always overestimate the amount of oil that's in place in the ROZ that I think I found. So let's go to the next slide.
This one is, I think, shows a core of this the interpretation that you conducted on the 679, and I think, as I understand, explain what this has to do with your critique of the Trentham models.
And again, what I've done here is I've shown, I believe I can't see very well, but I believe our interpretation's on there, and I've shown the oil saturations. But then what I've done is I've displayed Dr. Trenham's model using the salinity that he said I should use. I think I used the Gaines County, and we're in Lee County, so we're right across the border. But I used the model that he suggested in this cookbook, or he and Melzer cookbook, and you see that it predicts a pretty constant oil saturation in the 60% oil all the way through the interval, and doesn't match the core well at all. Then the other model, I said, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and we did not use the salinity that he pointed out in his cookbook, but use the actual salinity that we knew to be present. And you see, it does a little bit better job, but it still overpredicts the amount of oil in the ROZ. And my concern is this type of analysis may get people overly excited about their potential. Let's go to the next.
Sure. Just so for clarity on the record, this slide is 20, and the two far right tracks are your application of the Trentum models to the core data, correct?
Correct.
And the first, the second from the right is the one where you applied from the cookbook.
Right.
And then the farthest to the right is the one where you applied the
Used the correct RW.
Right. Okay. And the core data is in purple, right? Okay. Next slide here is your analysis or assessment of, I think, New Tech's revised analysis relative to what you have done. Will you explain what your critique or analysis is of New Tech's revised approach and how it relates to your analysis?
Well, yeah, and I've shown the original. We didn't have curves for the original. The original was M equal N equal 2, which basically resulted in the overestimation of oil saturation all the way through the interval. Now we were given in I guess it was October, November, a revised New Tech analysis. In that one, we talked about that quite a bit during the testimony of Mr. Dillman. But what that model was calibrated to the water saturations from the core. And I've got the core water saturations in that far right track. I think they're blue. And you see, yeah, they did a fairly decent job of matching to the core water saturations. The problem is the core water saturations don't represent the oil saturation, are not represented what the oil saturations would be at reservoir conditions. And what I've shown, I believe it's green, are the corrected oil saturations. And you see that even the revised model overestimates the oil saturations all the way through the interval. And, we were told that, well, maybe we should look at the original model as a high side and the revised model as a low side, and that develops a range, that we would consider. So therefore, we've considered uncertainty in the petrophysical model. I would argue that it's calibrated to the water saturation, which is the wrong thing to calibrate to, and both what they would consider the low side and the high side overestimate the amount of oil in place in that 679 core.
Next slide here. I think you do the same thing with the ops geologic analysis. Explain your critique of the ops geologic petrophysical analysis relative to what you have prepared in your analysis.
Yeah, and here we're talking a little bit more about ops, but the thing I wanted to point out here that what I plotted here are our estimates of the corrected core measurements. And what I would argue here is that both the ops low side and the high side, more often than not, overestimate the amount of oil present through that interval. Now, part of the reason that they gave for that was that they were trying to account for oil that was lost by the super flushing that we talked about, the stripping and the super flushing. They said, well, we're going to match as best we can to the data, but we're going to be a little optimistic to account for the fact that there was super flushing or stripping going on. And again, our analysis indicates that the pressure differentials at the bit weren't high enough for the permeabilities present for the super flushing or stripping to occur. And again, if you go back and do kind of what we did, we went back and looked at the hydrocarbon pore volume associated with each core point, and our model predicted that hydrocarbon pore volume within 4%. The ops in the ops model, for their low side case, if we didn't, they said, well, in the low side case, we use the raw core data without any correction. Well, even if we use our corrected core measurements, their low side is 30% higher than the corrected core measurements as far as the in-place volume, and 87% higher than the corrected saturation for the upside case. So my argument is the low side and high side on the ops are still optimistic compared to what the core data, the actual core measurements say that the presence of oil is. In a minute, I'll kind of show why that may have happened.
So just to be clear, this is slide 22. The second track from the right is NSAI, your analysis, showing the core data plotted in purple with your model in the dash blue, correct?
Correct.
And then on the far right track, the blue solid line is Ops Geologic's low side analysis.
I can't tell the color, but it's the lower of the two.
Okay, and then on the higher side on the right is the red, and that's the Ops Geologic's high side interpretation, correct?
Correct.
And then same thing, you've got the corrected core saturations on the same plot.
And my conclusion here is why there was a range established with the ops model. It seems to violate the core measurements. And again, I was criticized early on for not having a range. So we went back and looked at, ops established the precedent of, well, we're going to look at the corrected core, the range of uncertainty in the core measurements as the uncertainty in the petrophysics. And then they said, well, we're going to model our low side to uncorrected and our high side to maybe an optimistically or slightly optimistically corrected core measurement. Well, if I do that with ours, our correction factor for the core range from 1.1 to 1.3. And if I look at that in terms of uncertainty, that's about a plus or minus 10% uncertainty on each core saturation. That gives you a standard deviation of about 0.31 if you're interested in statistics. But the point is, if you want to look at the uncertainty in our petrophysical model, take the saturation calculations and vary them by plus or minus 10%. And that would be a reasonable uncertainty range based on the uncertainty that we see in the core measurements.
Thank you. Next plot, I think you do something similar again and look at a core that Ops Geologic had evaluated. Explain how this assessment of your model against the GSAU 522 well reflects your analysis as to your petrophysical approach.
And again, I won't belabor this one too long. There was some early concern about the fact that this 522 well indicated very high oil saturations in the San Andres, up to 60 and 70% in an interval that arguably had been water flooded. And that was put forth as evidence that, hey, there's high oil saturations in the San Andres, even in the water flooded intervals. We went back and looked at the data and found that oil had been added to the drilling mud just prior to the coring operations. And I won't go into it in great detail now. It's in my testimony. We identified an interval where we think maybe some spontaneous imbibition may occurred at the lower part of the core. In a higher part of the core, there may have been mobile oil present. I think there was some testing done. It indicated some mobile oil present in that green perforated interval in the depth track. And basically, we took our model. We didn't have this data early on. We had some electromagnetic propagation tool data, and we came to the conclusions based on analysis of that data. With the ops rebuttal, we were able to get the actual open hole log curves for this, which I didn't have at rebuttal time. Again, we ran our model in a blind test, and we were able to pretty much reproduce what the conclusions that we had drawn from the analysis of electromagnetic propagation tool in this well. And basically, we concluded that oil contamination was the reason for the high saturations, not that they were actually there from the beginning.
Thank you. This next slide here, I think, goes into more detail back onto the EMSU 660 and evaluates NewTek's revised analysis relative to some of the well tests that were conducted. If you would just explain what this slide shows and how it relates to your critique of NewTek's analysis.
Well, and this argument could go with it, with either the original new tech or the revised new tech, because up in the Grayburg, they're the same model. And basically we're calculating, we've talked about this before in some of our previous testimony or previous cross. This well is predicting that with new tech 60% oil saturations and above, up in the Grayburg in upper part of the San Andreas in intervals that tested basically very high water cuts. And we wouldn't expect the high water cuts, 93% plus cuts in intervals that were 60 to 80% water saturation. So I'll tell you that a conventional model in the shallow part, we would be running 2 and 2. Archie with 2 and 2, that's been demonstrated that just flat doesn't work below a producing oil water contact. I discovered it the hard way when I went to work for ARCO. Jerry Lucius produced a bunch of documents showing that using Archie, almost any constant M&N value generally results in the overestimating the oil saturations. So I think the new tech model is, they were moving in the right direction in new tech because they were going from a constant M&N to a variable M&N, which is the right direction, and trying to tie it as best they could to facies. The problem is they calibrated to the water saturations rather than the oil saturation. And again, we look at the actual physical measurements, which is the produced oil. It just doesn't seem to match with their high oil saturations from the modeling. Go to the next slide.
This next one, I think, again, you're looking at a mud log for the 746 well, and you're looking in this case at the ops geologic high and low assessments. Explain how your interpretation or assessment of the ops geologic petrophysical analysis conflicts with what your understanding of the mud log data.
And we're going to talk a little bit about why. And by the way, I'm nearly done for all y'all that are watching. The ops model, interestingly enough, calculates very high oil saturations and very low porosity rock. And the reason for that is more often than not, when you get low porosity rock, you have you get less than 5% porosity. A lot of those pores aren't talking to one another anymore. They become occluded with cement materials, pressure solution, which is the overburden pressure at the grain-to-grain contacts, basically melting the grains and causing dissolution precipitation reactions that could occlude the pores. So one pore is not communicating with the other. It's a very typical problem in low porosity carbonates. So what you see is you get low porosity because it can't conduct electricity very well anymore. The resistivities are elevated, and you can, if you just use an Archie model, regardless whether it's variable M&N or any type of model, you can calculate the presence of oil where there isn't any. And what I was trying to point out here is we're going down to an interval that's a low porosity rock, and I happen to have the mud log, and I showed the mud log through that interval shows absolutely no staining and no fluorescence, no anything, yet we're getting 60 to 80% oil saturation with the ops model. And I'll show you in a minute why that's occurring. But at one point, we scratched our head, how can we come up with oil when the mud logs are showing nothing's there? And particularly in a situation where we have oil wet rock. This is oil wet rock. And in oil wet rock, oil is going to coat the surfaces of the carbonate grains. So you'd expect to see something on the mud log. And the fact that there's no shows of any kind. The other giveaway is that your C1 is at background levels. So there was never any hydrocarbon there. So when we're, what you're seeing there is a low side and high side from the ops model in an interval that doesn't contain any hydrocarbon. That's where they're counting that hydrocarbon in their oil in place estimates. And again, this well tested zero oil.
All right, next slide. I think another kind of similar analysis showing mud log relative to what ops geologic had identified as having high levels.
And I may have gotten these slides just backwards from one another, but it's the same thing. We're seeing oil saturation in an interval that produced very little to no oil at all in low porosity rock.
Next slide here. Well,
go back one.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Yeah, which way were we going?
Did I
I think we went the wrong way.
I think I skipped a slide, Dr. Davis. I apologize. This next one here is the EMSU 746 mud log.
Yeah.
Showing the lower San Andreas. If you would just explain how, and this shows your analysis.
This shows our analysis. And granted, in that same interval, we calculated a little bit of oil in place. And I did not put any I didn't put any limiters in to say if the porosity gets below a certain level, don't calculate oil anymore. And we actually calculate a little bit of oil in there as well. So but it's kind of like pot calling the kettle black. I'm saying that ops kind of fouled up. Well, to be honest, we calculate a little bit of oil there too. But rather than eliminate it, we left it there because we don't know for sure, and we don't have mud logs in all the wells. So in order not to be overly pessimistic, I didn't say if the porosity gets to 5%, set oil saturation to 0. We just let it be what it was.
In this particular slide, your interpretation, your petrophysical interpretation is the second track from the right, correct?
Yes.
And I think you also show the farthest right track. You show Newtek's original and revised analyses.
Yes. Through that same interval. Okay. Yeah. Everybody's calculating oil in that interval.
Okay.
So, I'm as guilty as everybody else.
Very good. But I think your point here, though, Dr. Davison, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the saturations that are being calculated by both Newtek and Ops Geologic don't reflect, are not reflected in the mud logs, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Next one is the Meyer B434. I think you're showing here both your interpretation and Ops Geologic interpretation. And I think you had a comment here about floating oil.
Well,
explain what this shows and why their analysis doesn't jive with what you understand reality to be here.
Yeah, and what we're seeing here, again, it's an interval where we have low porosity and we're calculating reasonably high oil saturations in a portion of the rock that has low porosity. Then you go around that, what I'm calling the floating oil, above and below, and you get elevated porosity values with water saturations at 100%. And at one point, I think they stated they hypothesized that a residual oil zone could reside all the way from the Glorieta up into the upper San Andreas. And I'm having a trouble with the physics of oil only existing in the very poor quality rock and being completely flushed out with no residual at all in the better quality rock. It certainly doesn't seem to fit the data that we have on if that interval the higher porosity interval had been full of oil and it had been swept away, we at least expect to see residuals in the 20 to 40% range in that higher porosity interval, and we're not. So I think this is an artifact of the way that they chose their M&N values, and I think I'm going to show that in just a second.
Okay, yeah, explain. Now this next slide, I think, goes into that analysis where you've got a correlation. Explain what this shows and how, in your opinion, it reflects that Ops Geologic's petrophysical analysis is flawed.
So what we did is we went back and we took the core measurements, and I followed the procedure that Ops said that they followed. We took the core measurements, we corrected the saturations for each core point using the resistivity values. We calculated using the Archie model what M&N values would be, and I believe this is. I can't see. This is the Archie saturation. So this is N. So these are if I took each core point with the resistivity measurements, the porosity, what we knew the formation water salinity was, and I calculated what would the N value be for that core point, and then we plotted it as a function of our corrected oil saturation turned into water saturation. So 1 minus oil saturation to get the SW. And you see there indeed there is a trend there, but you see there's quite a variability in the N values as a function of porosity. For example, at a 5% porosity, I could have a couple of orders, 2 to 3 orders of magnitude variation in the N value for a given porosity. Now, the other thing we did is we took the 746 data and we backed out what Ops did was, as a function of porosity, they calculated what an N value would be. And then they applied an M and N, I think a constant M and then a variable N value using Archie's model to calculate the saturation as a function of porosity. And that line there represents the N value they would have selected for each porosity point. And you see that it ignores probably 80% of the measurements that were in the core. The core, had intervals which would have calculated much higher N values that were used in their final model. And I think that's why we're getting these floating oils and the 60% oil when you have 5% porosity, because the way it's designed, let's go to the next slide, and it's colored such that the best quality rock, the lowest, highest oil saturations, the lowest water saturations, I think are the green colors, and it's all along that leading edge. So what they've done is by choosing the correlation along the front end of that data, that they've made every possible porosity return the highest possible oil saturation. And I think that's why their model is overestimating in the core, generally leads to overestimation of the oil saturation in a lot of the points. And then in the lower San Andreas, when we get to low porosity intervals, is putting oil in the low saturation rock. So again, I think there may be an implicit bias based on the way that they modeled the Archie model they selected and the way they chose to select the variable N value.
Thank you, Dr. Davison. I think that's your last slide. I just have a few questions to sum up your opinions. Dr. Davison, what's your opinion about whether Goodnight's disposal zone is a residual oil zone?
The disposal zone, I don't believe is. There are several reasons for that. Predominantly because there's going to be oil in there in migration paths. It literally, probably billions of barrels of oil have flown through the San Andreas and to accumulate up into the Central Basin Platform over geologic time. There's going to be migration paths all through the San Andreas. However, when I look at the profiles, that's why we were talking so much about profiles, I don't see the profile of an ROZ anywhere below that high gamma ray marker. And where we do see oil, it's spread out, disparate, spread out by hundreds of feet. They typically, the better quality rock where the oil does appear to be, high saturation is usually less than a couple of feet thick. And the profiles around it don't have the nice flat front edge that you normally see. The other thing is, as far as an ROZ, there's for example, let's look at Seminole. It was created by a situation where they think they had a trap breach. And so the water moved up after the trap was breached, and there was a little bit of sweep, very little sweep, maybe a pore volume or so of sweep as that oil water contact moved up after the trap breach, creating that residual zone. It hasn't seen the lateral displacement that would exist in the ROZ, or excuse me, the sub, what I call the lower San Andreas, below that marker. That's had multiple pore volumes of water through it, and there's been a lot of dissolution reactions, and then it probably had a lot of H2S. In Dr. Lindsay's model, the way he's got it described is the water was moving down from the outcrops through this interval, and then H2S was bubbling back up through it. And in that world, you create sulfuric acid, and that would create the karst that we're seeing. When we're losing circulation, when we get below those layers of anhydrite, so we're entering a karsted, almost karsted type environment, very vuggy. Vugs are connected, very high permeability. That's why they're losing circulation. It's a different environment. That interval in the below those anhydrite layers has seen multiple volumes of water move through. A lot of H2S move through. A lot of rock has been dissolved. So it's a different beast. It's a different environment. If we go up into the interval, the Grayberg and the the upper San Andreas that Dr. Lindsay described, he's describing the karsting there as coming from more of a top down, where you had subaerial exposure and meliorative waters were flooding in, moving down through the rock and dissolving, creating little karst and fill. There was sand fill, silt fill into the karst, creating the San Andreas Grayburg boundary. There's karst up there, but the karsting that occurs in the below that high gamma ray marker is a whole different beast. It's the Trentham-Melzer model that describes the water, large volumes of water movement through there. And in that world, a couple of things that would occur. There'd be massive sweep. You'd be sweeping through intervals that probably contained only migration paths. And the other thing that would happen, any oil that would be down there would be dead because there's been too much water by, there's been fresh water by. The sweep would reduce would move all the light ends. You would the gas content would go low. It would be very poor quality, and it would probably exist only in those migration pathways. So I don't see an ROZ below that high gamma ray marker per se.
On that basis, Dr. Davison, do you have an opinion about whether that disposal zone where Goodnight's currently injecting produced water whether it's potentially productive as an ROZ?
I don't believe so.
What's your opinion about whether Empire's producing zone above your gamma ray marker and Goodnight's disposal zone below that gamma ray marker are in communication?
I see very little evidence of it. Predominantly, those bedded anhydrites are going to be very good layers. I think there's other barriers as well. Up in that interval, there's a lot of low porosity intervals that potentially be barriers. I think Bill Knights is going to address that more in some of his testimony, but there are ample barriers between the two. The other thing that bothers me is I don't see any evidence. I'm seeing maybe 70,000 barrels a day injected, 70,000 barrels a day produced. I think the modeler, Buckwalter, it seems to me that his testimony indicating the fact that there's some on the order of 20,000 barrels a day was leaking up into the San Andreas. I don't see any evidence of that from the production. There was a description of fractures, that might connect the two. The problem with that is that there's multiple intervals that have variable ductile behavior, and it'd be very hard to keep a fracture open in that environment between the San Andreas with all the diagenesis and the ductility of the different rock variations. I don't see a condition where you could have fracture communication, and if there were fracture communication, I expect you would see with the amount of water, again on order of I believe about 120,000 barrels a day injected. I believe I would see a bigger impact up in the Grayburg than no increase in water at all. I would expect to see that they would be producing more water than they're injecting if there were major fracture communication between the two.
Dr. Davison, what's your recommendation to the commission about what decision the commission should make based on everything you've heard in your analysis today?
Well, objection. This is outside the scope of his witness testimony, and it's improper to speculate by this witness in terms of what the commission should act on. But chiefly, this is outside the scope of any of the direct testimony.
Rephrase the question.
Sure. Dr. Davison, do you have an opinion about whether Goodnight's injection is causing waste in the purported San Andreas?
No, I don't believe.
Objection. With respect to the definition of waste, that involves the witness has offered zero testimony in any of his filed statements about waste. You can keyword search the word waste. It's nowhere in there. The idea of testifying to this commission about waste is outside the scope of anything that we've had an opportunity to prepare for.
Mr. Rankin?
Mm-hmm.
Response?
Well, I think waste is a question. It is a legal term, but it's also a question of whether or not there's actually waste occurring. It's a technical issue that Dr. Davison has evaluated in detail about whether or not there's any impact on ultimate recovery in the purported RZ below his gamma ray marker. And I'm asking him whether or not in his analysis, there's any in his view, adverse effect to ultimate recovery from the the zone below his gamma ray marker.
I'll sustain the objection. I think he's already answered that question.
Okay. Dr. Davison, is there any basis in your opinion, for the commission to suspend Goodnight's existing disposal?
Same objection. This is outside the scope of anything he's testified on. This is, and it would be so multidisciplinary that it's absolutely inappropriate for this witness to offer speculation on this point.
Well, if I may respond, Mr. Hearing Officer, at the very outset of Dr. Davison's testimony, it's outlined in his direct testimony that one of the things he was directly asked to do was to determine whether or not there's any impact from the injection, and that goes right to his opinion that he's directly was within his scope of testimony.
Well, we've heard his opinion, and I think it's up to the commission to decide the question that you're asking him to. You're basically asking the witness to tell the commission how to decide the case. So, okay. Sustained.
Dr. Davison, we've heard a lot of testimony from Empire's witnesses about whether or not there's enough data for the commission to make a decision. In your opinion, does the commission need more data to make this decision today?
I don't believe so.
And why is that?
Well, the San Andreas has been very well studied. And I mean, we brought all the data that, we've got the core data from the zone that arguably is one that would be amenable to some sort of EOR type operations, and looking at what's going on in what I call the injection zone. We see no evidence of the existence of an ROZ. The increased injection, I don't think is going to be a problem. One, it doesn't appear that the pressure's significantly increasing down there. And again, I look at this thing regionally. I think everybody is maybe got a little bit of blinders on. The Trentham-Melzer theory speculates water movement from even west of the Guadalupe Mountains all the way into the Central Basin Platform. That's a big area. And we go back and look at the Central Basin Platform before major water flood operations started. There's been something like 7 billion barrels produced out of that. Well, this aquifer is attached to that. So there's been a tremendous amount of withdrawals. It's something arguably, Trentham-Melzer, one of my former colleagues at ARCO, Alton Brown, has speculated that the aquifer to the west and southeast New Mexico is connected to the Central Basin Platform. Dr. Brown actually
object to the hearsay. Additionally, what he's speaking to, he has characterized himself as speculation. So the hearsay statement about speculation would also be speculation.
Well, we have a relaxed standard for hearsay in these administrative proceedings, but speculation on top of speculation.
Well, I guess maybe I can ask Dr. Davison to maybe kind of reconsider or rephrase his statement. But I think Dr. Davison, you were testifying about the connectivity of the San Andreas with the broader reservoirs or formations, and I guess you can explain why you believe that's important for the commission to consider.
And with respect to communication amongst water communication outside of the EMSU, none of this is in the witness statements. So this is nothing that has been disclosed prior to today. We object that it's outside.
Dr. Davison is responding to the testimony of Empire's witnesses that he heard throughout the course of the hearing for the last 2 weeks.
Okay, you still have lots of witnesses to go. Are you not going to cover this territory with anybody else?
I think it will be addressed. And so that said, I think Dr. Davison had something to say about it, and he was letting the commission know.
Well, I mean, Dr. Davidson has a lot to say about a lot of things. I think, you know, it's not fair to Empire to bring up stuff that is new and wasn't disclosed in his testimony. So if you're going to cover it with another witness, I'll sustain the objection.
Dr. Davison, I think the last topic I want to discuss with you is one that has come up in response to questioning from Empire, and also in response to some of the commissioner's questions. And this goes to obtaining core for the lower San Andreas, the disposal zone within the EMSU. Based on your experience, Dr. Davison, in response to those questions and the questions from the commission, would you, what's your opinion about coring in the interval below your gamma ray marker, and whether that can be done and whether it should be attempted?
Above the marker, you basically have a pretty tame environment without a lot of karsting. Below that marker, all indications are there's quite a bit of karsting, and I've got a lot of experience with that in working with the Pemex oil fields. The Akal field is a field that I've done extensive work with, and it's got a tremendous amount of karsting. And what they find when they try to core through the Akal field is when they get into the karsted intervals, they have tremendous lost circulation problems, and more often than not, that they stick the core barrel, stick the pipe due to the lost circulation, and then when they do finally get the core barrel out, it contains maybe 10% of the cored interval, and the remaining rock that's in the core is the poor quality rock, and so you really don't learn much. In drilling below those anhydrite layers, Goodnight has lost circulation and many times had to drill for long periods of time with no returns at all, and losing tens of thousands of barrels into the wells. And I would caution anybody to go in and try to do a pressure core or a sponge core or anything like that the first time through until you learn about the coring conditions. It's going to be difficult because of the karsting and the lost circulation. And I mean, I can understand why Goodnight wouldn't do it, because you're basically, it's an expensive operation, and you're potentially going to lose a lot of equipment in the hole. And then if you do get the core barrel out, the data is not potentially going to be that good. Now, occasionally a blind squirrel finds a nut, and you drill into an area where there hasn't been, the extensive karsting, you may be able to get a conventional core out, but I think it'd be a crapshoot.
Thank you, Dr. Davidson. Mr. Hearing Officer, at this time, I have no further questions of Dr. Davidson. Dr. Davidson, before I let you go, and before you just want to make sure that you addressed everything that you wanted the commission to understand about your analysis and your assessment of the situation in the purported ROZ in the lower San Andreas.
I'd just like to make a statement. Hopefully I won't get objected to. I expect I will. But I see the upper San Andreas as being above that marker as being a conventionally karsted interval where it's top down due to meteoric water input with subaerially exposed rock. Below that marker, it's the Trentham-Melzer Alton Brown model, but we've had multiple pore volumes of water through, and it's karsted. How do I know it's karsted? Because we can inject so many volumes. So much high volume injection on a vacuum, it's got to be karsted, because if you look at the permeability of the rock that's there, it's not sufficiently high enough of the rock types present to handle the injection that's being injected. I haven't seen evidence of an ROZ in a highly karsted interval. The Seminole San Andreas was not. That was an interval. That was a situation where you had a contact move up due to a breach of a trap, and we're moving into undocumented territory. I haven't seen a sustained ROZ project in a highly karsted interval. I haven't seen evidence of it anywhere. So I think this is potentially we're treading into a new world, looking for an ROZ in a highly karsted interval. This had this much water and CO2. I mean, this much water and H2S through it.
Just to clarify, and based on your assessment, it's your determination that that it's not a potential RZ in that zone, correct?
I do not believe there is. No.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I have no further questions of this witness and make them available for cross-examination by other parties.
Okay, it's almost 11:35. We have a couple of options. We could, Chairman Rosados, are you there?
I am.
I'm just thinking, we could give Empire the lunch hour to work on their, cross-examination, and come back sooner, or we could start it now and, a break conventionally at noon. What would be your thoughts?
I was just thinking that we break conventionally at noon.
Okay, are you okay with that, Mr. Waymire? You got enough to keep us going for the next 25 minutes, I suspect.
Absolutely. We're happy to proceed now.
All right, great. Then it's your cross-examination, Mr. Waymire.
Thank you. And just for record reference, the direct there was 2 hours and 12 minutes as we keep track of time.
I believe that was shorter than your longest witness, if I remember properly.
And Dr. David, I'm not going to argue with you. My goal is to just get some of this testimony out so that we can get the commission to some decisions.
Just make sure that comment doesn't end up being a boomerang.
Dr. Davidson, as we talk about, I always like to divide expert things up into qualifications, data relied on, methods, and conclusions. I want to talk a little bit by way of qualifications first. In terms of EOR experience in the Permian Basin, was the last time you had that was a little bit over 40 years ago at ARCO?
In the Permian Basin, yes, not in the world.
Okay, so if the commission wants to know your last EOR experience in the Permian Basin, that was about 41, 42-ish years ago at ARCO.
My last EOR experience in the world was a few weeks ago.
Prior to this engagement, you've never had any experience at all in New Mexico?
Not in Mexico, no.
Now, in terms of the data relied on here, I want to visit a little bit about that. The core, we obviously have the 679 core in the EMSU that extends partially into the San Andreas, correct?
Right.
Was there any other core within the EMSU that you had available here by way of data?
Well, eventually the RR Bell.
But you didn't use that as part of your first two analyses, is that right?
We used it for purposes of looking at ranges and porosities and permeabilities, but we weren't quite sure whether it was Grayburg or San Andreas.
Any other core inside the EMSU?
No.
Now, in terms of, I'm not talking about triple combo logs, but in terms of spectral gamma, what wells did you have available as part of your original analysis with spectral gamma in the EMSU?
None in the EMSU. I think one of the wells we had was in the AGU.
So again, if you'll just listen to the question is within the EMSU, if the commission wants to know what wells you looked at, analyzed, studied, correlated, that had spectral gamma, the answer would be 0.
I answered that question when you asked it the first time.
Is it 0?
No, I said, no, there was no wells in the EMSU that had spectral gammas that we had available to us.
Now,
why are we beating this to death?
And again, earlier, do you remember telling the commission that they would not need any additional data to make their decisions here?
I do.
Okay, so the only core we have is the 679 and the RR Bell, which you didn't use the RR Bell in the opening analysis. We have 0 spectral gamma in the EMSU. What about sonic logs in the EMSU?
I wasn't aware of any. We went on a wild goose chase with some of the new tech data, only to find out that it was synthetic sonic data.
So is the answer, as you testified to the commission, that they have all the data they need on sonic logs within the EMSU? You had exactly 0 sonic logs,
That's
correct? Correct.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of going back briefly to qualifications, you are not a geologist.
No,
And you don't hold yourself out as doing any expert work in this case in a geology capacity. Is that right?
that's correct.
And as we talk about tops and where the San Andreas is and where the Grayberg is, I didn't take your deposition, but I've reviewed your deposition, and you were emphatic and repetitive that you did not pick any tops here. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in terms of where the Goodnight tops would have even come from, that required speculation on your part. You didn't know where the tops would have even come from for sure, did you?
Sure.
And with respect to Netherlands Sewell didn't do any analysis by way of the work of Mr. Knights or anyone else to identify tops here, did they?
No,
Is that work you could have done had Goodnight asked you to do it?
I wouldn't have gone down that path. I don't believe that, Lucia used to tell me that.
My question is, if you just listen to my question, the question is identifying a top of the San Andreas work that Netherlands Sewell could have done if it was asked? Yes or no?
I wouldn't have done it. Netherlands Sewell could have done it.
Netherlands Sewell could do it?
Yes.
Okay. Now, coming back to just Netherlands Sewell and some of your experience, with respect to your day-to-day, like what you're doing on the majority of days that just occupies your 8 to 5. You with me so far on what we're talking about?
So far.
Is that predominantly reserve evaluation for bank lending and for SEC filing?
We do that as well as advisory studies for national and convention and regular oil and gas companies as well.
My question is, you personally, is the vast majority of your day-to-day 8 to 5 work, Monday through Friday, spent performing reserve evaluations on behalf of companies that need them for SEC filings and or banks that are using it for lending?
That would probably occupy maybe 50% of my time.
The remaining 50% is what?
Doing specialty studies for national oil companies, where we were hired to do specific field studies for major and independent oil and gas companies, equity work, that working when there's equity disputes between different owners in a common oil field.
Can you tell the commission about when the last time you would have been personally engaged to identify impermeable barriers?
That would be probably a few weeks ago.
In what context?
We're working on another lawsuit in Australia where migration up in that wellbore is one of the contentions. I can't give any details on it. It's confidential.
Coming back to just what Netherlands Sewell does, and again, I heard in your description in response to Mr. Rankin's questions, you specifically mentioned assisting with reserve evaluation and bank lending and for SEC filings. You would agree here, as we just talked forest for the trees. On forest for the trees, New Tech performed 2 rounds of oil in place evaluations here that would both be significantly more optimistic than what you came up with, true?
Correct.
And Ops Geologic performed work here and arrived at oil in place estimations that would also be significantly optimistic to what you and Netherlands Sewell did here. Isn't that true?
That's correct, but they're also optimistic to the core measurements.
Well, let's speak to the core measurements just briefly. But before I do that, you've also been in the examination room when the Exxon sales brochure has been published. You've seen that?
I have.
And you can tell the commissioners that Exxon is also significantly more optimistic about its estimations of oil in place at EMSU as compared to the work here that Netherlands Sewell did. Yes?
Yes, and if you look at their 25% average through the 679 core, the core data doesn't support that.
With respect to the 679 core, and well, let's just put a bow around this. So we've seen 2 rounds of analysis from New Tech. We've seen Exxon's analysis, and we've seen Ops Geologic analysis, and you can tell the commissioners that this is just a yes or no. Netherlands Sewell here is pessimistic to all 4 of those evaluations. Yes?
I'd say Netherlands Sewell is correct and the others are all overly optimistic.
That's your testimony is they've all got it wrong. Yeah.
Yes.
As we talk about, do you remember visiting about certainty back in your deposition?
Mm-hmm.
And you said here that if in terms of your oil in place, if you were to put a percentage on it, that would be 50% certain.
No, I said it was a 50% probability, which is the most likely case. If you read my corrected version of my verbal testimony, I made that correction. I was talking about a P50 percentile probability, which is a most likely case. And that was corrected in my written response to the verbal deposition.
So you want to use the testimony you changed from the first time you swore to the 50%?
I misspoke in the first, but Ms. Shaheen tripped me up. I was talking about probability, not uncertainty. I was talking about 50 percentile in the probability range. And again, I corrected it in the testimony to reflect that properly.
Let's look briefly at the testimony, since you just said that Ms. Shaheen tripped you up, that this was something she did.
Which it wasn't in purpose, but
you said
I misunderstood the statement when it was given, and I said yes when I should have clarified that it was 50 percentile uncertainty on the uncertainty range, not 50% uncertainty.
So I'm going to try to share this screen if I can do this correctly. As we talk about this 50% and Ms. Shaheen tripping you up, and you recall what she was asking you about was the certainty with respect to potential residual oil zones and oil in place. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And you said, I'm reading from page 46, line 21. I'm saying we can't say that we could differentiate between 35 or 36%, but the evaluation would be reasonably certain to identify intervals that would be potential residual oil zones. She asked you again, and so again, I don't think you've answered my question yet. What do you mean by reasonably certain? Answer, I would be reasonably certain that we identified potential intervals containing mobile oil under CO2 flood. And does reasonably certain mean that you are 50% sure? Answer, that would probably be a reasonable estimate. That would be a most likely estimate. And then you were asked about the aerial continuity as a result of the sparse well control, and you said that's part of the problem. We don't know the aerial continuity. So again, when you told Miss Hardy that, strike that, when you told Miss Shaheen that you were reasonably certain, that is 50% certain, that you've identified intervals that would be potential residual oil zones, it's now your testimony that you meant something else.
I mean, our estimate would be a most likely case, which I said in the very next sentence that it's most likely, and I corrected the testimony to represent that it wasn't 50%. I'm 50% certain that it's a P50 or a 50% probability, which is a most likely case. Our answer is the most likely case.
Now, the core, we visited with Mr. Macbeth a couple of weeks ago. He said core is direct evidence. And you would tell this commission that based on the opinions of Netherland Sewell, we don't need a core down to the bottom of the San Andreas here, right?
Not saying you don't need one. I'm saying it'd be very difficult to get one. And I'm not sure the value of it, given the fact that doesn't appear to be much oil down there.
In terms of your oil in place assessments, isn't the rock facies very important to that?
Yes.
You have to know what is the rock facies down in the San Andreas, because if you're off on the rock facies, everything else falls apart. Isn't that right?
Yes.
With respect to the different rock facies, there's been a lot of discussion about wax stone, and I want to pronounce, I've heard it different ways. Do you pronounce it wacky stone or wax stone?
I prefer wax stone because the other sounds silly to me, but judges would disagree.
Okay, I've been calling it wax stone, but I thought I heard somebody today call it differently. And then as you would say that's the least desirous rock facies, or there's even worse than that?
Mudstone. Lime mudstone is worse.
Did you have lime mudstone in your interpretations?
We did. When we found thick limes less than 5%, it was generally classified as lime mudstone.
Is that what you're calling the non-reservoir?
It's generally non-reservoir, yes.
And I'm just trying to get to your terminology because in your papers you discussed non-reservoirs. Is that what you're calling the mud limestone?
That's one of the non-reservoir facies, yes.
So we have wax stone, and then you would move over one to mud-dominated pack stone. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you would move over to a grain stone?
Grain-dominated mudstone.
And then as you continue moving over, what would be the next?
Grain stone, and then a molded grain stone.
Now, as we come back to the core here, did you ever personally look at the core?
Never had the opportunity.
What did you do to try to gain access to the core to be able to actually evaluate the core?
I wasn't aware that it was available at the Bureau, where I would have gone to look.
Why were you not aware that the core was available at the Bureau?
Yeah. I didn't know where it was.
As we talk about studying the core being our direct evidence here in terms of rock typing, can you tell the commissioners about everything you did to try to get access to that core?
I didn't try at all. I assumed that it was that Empire had it, and we couldn't get available to it. However, looking at the core being valuable in and of itself, I had the core measurements, and with the core measurements and the data we had from the outcrop, I was able to do a reasonable job of doing rock typing based on what I learned from the outcrop study.
Okay, and I may have forgotten I thought my question was, can you describe to the commissioners everything you did to get access to the core?
I told you we didn't know that we could get access to it.
The RR Bell, did you ever get access to the RR Bell core to evaluate that core?
And to be honest with you, I was a little surprised that Dr. Lindsay went back and looked at both cores, and we weren't invited to go look at it with him.
So the first time was Ms. Shaheen's fault, and this one is
I'm not saying it's a
this one's
fault. I'm saying we weren't aware that the core data was even available.
Doctor, it's human nature, but for the court reporter's sake, you guys please try not to talk over each other. She can only take down one person at a time.
Okay.
And I apologize to Madam Court Reporter for my part in it. Now, coming back to the RR Bell, you said, Doctor, you were surprised, was how you described it, that Dr. Lindsay didn't invite you to look at the RR Bell core or the 679 core. And so earlier when you said that you would maybe be 50% certain on your oil in place estimations, and you said that was the fault of Ms. Shaheen for tripping you up. The reason you didn't look at the cores here as part of your work where your work being very important by way of facies of rock, that one's Dr. Lindsay's fault for not inviting you?
I don't know that it's anybody's fault. I just seemed like if data was being evaluated, both parties would have been invited to take it, you know. That's not my position to lay fault. It seemed like it would have been a fair thing to do.
But Dr. Lindsay, who you've heard testimony in this case, the first witness that Empire called, he did actually study the R Bell core, didn't he?
He did.
He also studied the 679 core, didn't he?
Yes.
Now, in terms of any fracture studies, did you perform any fracture studies from any of the core?
No.
But you did see that Dr. Lindsay performed a fracture study in connection with the 679.
Yes.
He's also prepared one for the R Bell. I don't want you to say you wanted information. Would you like to see the R Bell fracture study?
At this late stage, it wouldn't be of any value to me.
Why is that?
We're coming to the end of the end of the hearing.
But isn't the goal here to get it right?
Yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of any other fracture studies, did you see any other fracture studies by way of data relied on here besides the one prepared by Dr. Lindsay?
I did not.
As you talk about the concept of communication between the Grayburg and the San Andreas, wouldn't fracture studies be something you would want to see?
I saw ones available, but in my view, the fracture studies up in the upper San Andreas wouldn't have much impact on what's going on down in the lower San Andreas.
Do you know what areas Dr. Lindsay performed his fracture study on in terms of in relation to the Lovington sand?
I assume it was above, but below the Lovington, it would be very hard without core data to infer much of anything because of the high ductility of some of the intervening layers, and it'd be hard to predict whether the fractures penetrated down or not, whether there'd been any diagenesis that had closed the fractures, what the stress field was, what's the arc of the formation top, where in the system do I go from extensional to compressional? Do I have ductile layers that would isolate the two? I didn't see anything that went to that level of sophistication.
Is your testimony to the commissioners that you don't even know where, by way of depth interval, the fracture study that Dr. Lindsay performed is?
I suspect he did a regional study that would include projecting down, but that's a very hard thing to do without direct evidence to support other than a geomechanical model that would predict such an extension.
My question is, do you know where, by way of depth interval,
I do not.
Dr. Lindsay's fracture study was performed?
I do not.
But that didn't stop you from offering opinions to the commissioners here under oath about communication between the San Andreas and the Grayburg, correct?
That's correct.
The other thing I want to ask, as we talk about the core on the 679, did you do anything to depth shift that core in relation to the wire line?
Yes, we did.
How far did you depth shift it?
As I remember, it was variable, but it was a few feet up and down the core.
Now, as we talk about how important your rock facies is, wouldn't it be important to look at the only core description you've seen here was the one prepared by Dr. Lindsay on the 679, right?
No, I saw the core description prepared by, I guess it was Western Atlas, whoever wrote the report, the digital report.
Did you rely on either one?
I relied on both.
Now, I want to see if I can get over. And I have this on a poster board if it helps. What we've done is actually compare your rock facies against Dr. Lindsay's core description and core interpretations. Have you ever actually tried to correlate here by actually mapping your different facies against Dr. Lindsay's descriptions in a graphic such as this?
I have not.
Trying to get into. There we go. Is it coming up where you can read it?
Not yet, but I'm never going to be able to see this. So get on with your point.
Well, what, I guess, how may I approach with the poster board just in case it helps? I knew you had some vision issues and I wanted to be sensitive to that. So I brought this in hard copy.
Mr. Rankin, if you need to move to see what he's.
Well, I guess I don't know who prepared this. It wasn't part of anybody's direct testimony or cross or rebuttal, so I don't know where this came from. I guess that's one of my initial questions.
So, see Dr. Lindsay's core descriptions on the right. And they've been compared against your facies model off of the core.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I guess I'll just initial objection for clarification on the origin or provenance of this exhibit or potential exhibit. I don't know where it came from. I don't know who prepared it, and I don't know the foundation for it at this point.
Well, it's not being offered as far as I can tell. So far, it's a demonstrative aid. Is that correct, Mr. Waymeyer?
That's exactly correct. Thank you.
And by the way, we're approaching we're at the noon hour, but go ahead if you want to finish your point.
Thank you. If you'll indulge 2 minutes, I think I can finish this point.
All right.
So here, for example, in your facies model in the 679, do you see this large interval that you're showing as non-reservoir?
In our model, any interval below 7% porosity is considered non-reservoir.
I'm just saying, in your model, do you see that there's this large interval that you describe as non-reservoir?
I don't know how you got to that figure.
The figure, this is straight out of your work where you show this interval right here as non-reservoir.
And we eliminated intervals that had high anhydrite saturations as non-reservoir, yes.
But if you go over to Bob Lindsay's core description, he actually has laid eyes on this core, studied it, wrote about it, and it is in fact colloidal packstone where the core reports oil saturation of 13%. Why? Can you just explain to the commissioners how, under your model, when the direct evidence we have comes out of the 679 core, you could be showing something as non-reservoir that under Bob Lindsay's description is 13% porosity, 13% oil saturation and colloidal packstone.
In our modeling, we eliminated intervals that were lower than 7% porosity that had indicated elevated anhydrite contents from the core measurements that we used to calibrate the model. I realized that some of those intervals in the core, we also pointed out that we were concerned that intervals that had indicated high anhydrite intervals could be potentially damaged during the core handling procedures. And we felt like they were somewhat unreliable from the perspective of doing a core match. So from the combination of eliminating what indicated low porosity rocks, our modeling indicated it had high, potentially high anhydrite values, we eliminated some of the rocks, the actual core measurements from the modeling procedure, so as to try to concentrate on the better quality rock.
If we move just a little bit deeper in the wellbore, we have sections with 30% saturation, oil saturation, actually measured in the core and described by Bob Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay, as reservoir rock, and you're showing that non-reservoir. How can that be?
Again, those would be the intervals where the log indicated that they had high potential anhydrite. And again, I'm curious how you got to that description. That was never delivered.
What was that delivered?
The facies model values.
Did you actually take the facies model to see where in relation to Dr. Lindsay's descriptions, the rock types?
We did. And again, there was concern that some of that data was associated with karsted intervals that potentially contained anhydrite that wasn't there anymore by the time the core came to surface. So rather than try to deal with the uncertainty, we eliminated it and concentrated on modeling where we didn't have the uncertainty in the presence of anhydrite.
Well, as an example, at 4,200 feet, TBD, did Dr. Lindsay describe karsting?
He did. And karsted interval is potentially one where you would have had anhydrite, and that anhydrite may not be there anymore by the time this well wasn't cored with salt saturated fluid, and there's a potential that anhydrite that may have been there wasn't there anymore. We certainly saw that in the outcrop areas, the intervals in the outcrop, the anhydrite to be completely dissolved away. I wasn't sure whether or not that potential existed. So rather than deal with the uncertain data, we ignored it when we were doing the core modeling.
You ignored what?
The intervals that had indicated high anhydrite content from the logs.
Your facies model doesn't even identify the Lovington sand, does it?
I don't know what the Lovington sand is.
So as we talk about how important your model, facies is to your model, you do not even know what the Lovington sand is. True?
It's described as a dolomitic sandstone.
I'm trespassing on the goodwill of folks that want to eat. I'm happy to pick this back up after lunch or proceed at the commission's pleasure.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, what is the commission's pleasure? When do you want to reconvene?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it, please?
Sure. It's 6 after 12. Mr. Waymeyer is at a stopping point for
Yes.
now. What's the commission's pleasure in terms of when we reconvene?
Let's come back at around 1:15.
1:15 it is. Thank you. We'll be off the record until then.
Thank you.
That was yours, yeah.